What if the oldest stories of humanity were not only trying to explain where people came from, but trying to preserve a memory someone powerful wished would fade? Somewhere inside the broken clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, there is a strange problem. The gods do not always behave like distant, glowing beings floating beyond the clouds. In many Sumerian and Akkadian texts, they argue, assign labour, gather in councils, measure destinies, choose cities, punish noise, protect temples, and worry about human behaviour. They appear less like vague spirits and more like rulers of an ancient system. Archaeologists found many of these stories in fragments. Some were pulled from temple ruins. Some rested for centuries beneath dust, ash, collapsed brick, and forgotten floors. Some eventually reached museums, where historians and Assyriologists studied their signs under careful light. Line by line, they tried to hear old voices through damaged clay. And within those voices, one question remains quietly unsettling. Why would the Anunnaki, those great divine beings of Mesopotamian tradition, ever fear what humans could remember? Not what humans could build, not what humans could conquer, not even what humans could worship incorrectly, but what they might carry inside themselves, beneath speech, ritual, dream, and story. A memory older than kings, older than cities, older, perhaps, than the first safe version of the past. You do not begin in a desert of fantasy. You begin with clay. Clay is practical, humble, and almost stubbornly earthly. It accepts the pressure of a reed stylus. It dries in the sun. It survives fire by accident. A wooden tablet rots. Papyrus dissolves. Skin and cloth vanish. But clay, once baked by disaster or time, can endure long after the hands that shaped it are dust. That is why Mesopotamia still speaks. You are standing in the mind, before a tablet no bigger than your hand. Its edges are chipped. Its surface is crowded with wedge-shaped marks. Some signs are clean. Others are broken where the corner has fallen away. The tablet does not explain itself. It waits. You can almost feel the patient silence of it. The silence of something that has already outlived every empire that tried to own it. A museum label may call it myth, literature, royal tradition, or theological composition. That is reasonable. It may tell you the tablet belongs to a scribal tradition from ancient Mesopotamia, a world of city-states, temple households, canals, fields, merchants, kings, priests, and workers. That is also true. The careful reading matters. Without it, the ancient past becomes only smoke. Yet the smoke does not vanish completely. In these records, the Anunnaki appear as a class of powerful gods connected with authority, judgment, and the ordering of the world. Their exact role changes across time and texts. Sumerian religion was not a single frozen system. It shifted from city to city, century to century, language to language. A god who stood in one position in an early hymn might appear differently in a later Babylonian composition. Memory itself changed shape as it travelled. That is one of the first quiet clues. The past was not remembered once. It was remembered repeatedly. It was copied by scribes, taught in schools, sung in temples, reshaped by kings, and placed inside rituals. A story could preserve a very old image while also serving a new political order. A divine name could remain steady while its meaning slowly moved beneath the surface. The old scribes knew this better than anyone. Imagine the scratch of reed against damp clay. Not loudly, just a dry, soft pressing sound. A student bends over a small tablet in an Eridu, a scribal school, trying to copy signs correctly. His teacher may not be gentle. Sumerian scribal education was demanding, repetitive, and full of discipline. The student learns lists of words, names of professions, names of cities, names of gods. He learns that civilization itself can be arranged into categories. That little detail matters. A culture that makes long lists is a culture that fears losing order. A list of gods protects hierarchy. A list of kings protects legitimacy. A list of offerings protects the temple economy. A list of words protects language against forgetfulness. The scribble world does not merely record memory, it trains memory, fences it, standardizes it, and gives it official form. Softly, the mystery begins there. If human memory was simply private, why did ancient institutions work so hard to organize it? Why preserve certain names with sacred care, while letting other things disappear into silence? The common answer is practical. Temples needed records, kings needed authority, farmers needed calendars, merchants needed accounts. No mystery is required to explain clay tablets filled with barley, sheep, oil, labour, and taxes. But then the myths arrive. They do not arrive like thunder. They arrive like a second layer beneath the accounting tablets. In the creation stories, in flood traditions, in divine councils, and in tales of wisdom brought from beyond ordinary human life, the records begin to whisper about a time when the relationship between gods and people was closer, stranger, and more dangerous than later order allowed. The Anunnaki were not always described in one simple way. Sometimes they are linked with the underworld. Sometimes they appear as great gods who sit in judgment. Sometimes their number seems vast, almost administrative, as though divine power itself were organized into ranks. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the evidence. It is part of the evidence. The record is fragmentary, and the fragments do not always agree. That is where responsible mystery lives, not in claiming that every broken sign hides a forbidden fact, not in pretending that modern imagination can replace translation, but in noticing that ancient people themselves preserved contradictions. They told stories in which gods created humans to relieve divine labour, yet feared human noise. They described kingship descending from heaven, yet placed human rulers into earthly cities. They remembered a flood that interrupted history, yet continued to preserve lists that reached back beyond it. There is a strange pressure in that. You feel it as you step away from the museum glass and into the older landscape behind the tablet. The air warms. The floor beneath you becomes packed earth. The scent of wet clay rises near the riverbank, mixed with reeds, animals, smoke, and the faint bitterness of bitumen. The world is southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates fed marshes, canals, fields, and cities made from mud brick. Nothing here feels empty. Workers move along irrigation channels, priests pass through temple courtyards, scribes carry tablets in baskets, merchants measure grain, children learn signs. At dusk, the mud brick walls glow red, then violet, then almost black. Above them, the stars appear with a clarity modern cities have mostly forgotten. Somewhere nearby, a tablet is drying. On it may be a hymn to a god, a record of sheep, a school exercise, a legal agreement, or a story of beginnings. To us, those categories seem separate. To the ancient city, they belong to the same world of order, grain, law, gods, labour, kingship, and memory passed through the temple's shadow. This is why the Anunnaki question cannot be rushed. If there was ever a fear of human memory in these traditions, it was not necessarily a fear of ordinary remembering. It may have been a fear of unregulated memory. Memory outside ritual. Memory that reached behind authorized origins. A person who remembers the wrong beginning may no longer accept the official one. A city that remembers a time before its temple may question its temple. A people who remember a world before their rulers may begin to wonder who gave those rulers their names. That thought is quiet. It does not need to shout. One cautious reading of Mesopotamian myth suggests that memory was a sacred technology. It could stabilize civilization, but it could also disturb it. The flood could cleanse the world, but stories of before the flood still survived. The gods could assign destinies, but humans could write them down. Kings could claim ancient legitimacy, but scribes could preserve older, stranger lists, and Clay could remember what living voices were told to forget. The first mystery is not whether the Anunnaki were literally afraid in the human sense. Ancient texts do not give us that simple answer. The deeper question is why Mesopotamian tradition repeatedly returns to control, order, divine decree, lost knowledge, and fragile remembrance. It is as though the earliest literate civilization kept circling one uneasy idea. Human beings were made to serve, but they also remembered, and once memory entered clay, even the gods could not easily bury it again. The first thing you notice beneath the temple is not treasure. It is dust. Dust gathers in the seams of mud brick walls, in the corners of storage rooms, along the broken edges of tablets stacked like sleeping stones. It softens everything. It makes even the ancient shelves look less like furniture and more like part of the earth itself. When excavators uncovered rooms like these in Mesopotamian sites, they were not always entering grand halls of gold and ceremony. Often, they were entering places of work, administration, teaching, and memory. The temple was not only a house for a god, it was an institution, a storehouse, a workplace, a school, and a centre of power. In Sumerian cities, temple households could manage fields, animals, labourers, craftsmen, offerings, and goods. Their records were practical and sacred at the same time. A tablet counting barley was not just boring paperwork. It was part of keeping the god's estate in balance, and balance was a holy matter. That is why the scribe matters so deeply. You can picture him sitting on a reed mat in a shaded room, his knees folded beneath him, a small lump of clay resting in one hand. His reed stylus is cut cleanly at the end. With it, he presses signs into the damp surface, not writing in flowing lines, but making impressions. Each mark is deliberate. Each wedge depends on pressure, angle, and habit. He is not inventing memory. He is submitting it to form. The scribal profession in ancient Mesopotamia required years of training. Students copied word lists, proverbs, model contracts, hymns, and literary compositions. They practiced Sumerian even when Akkadian became the common spoken language in many later periods. This created a strange world where an older language survived in schools, rituals, and scholarship, almost like a sacred inheritance. Here is a quiet attention point. A civilization can preserve a language after most people stop speaking it daily. That means a memory can continue even when ordinary life has moved on. It can become ceremonial, elite, controlled, and difficult to access. The past does not disappear. It becomes specialized. You feel the coolness of the archive room. Outside, the sun presses down on the city. Inside, shadows cling to the lower walls. A basket holds small tablets recording rations. Another contains practice exercises. A larger tablet rests flat, inscribed on both sides. It may contain a hymn, a myth, or a royal inscription copied by a student who only half understood the old language he was preserving. That is not failure. That is history being carried by imperfect hands. In this world, memory belongs to trained people. A farmer may remember the flood levels, the seasons, the debts owed by a neighbour, the story told by his grandfather. But the temple scribe preserves memory in another way. He writes what the institution needs to survive. He writes what a god's household claims. He writes what kings want repeated. He writes what teachers decide students should copy. And sometimes, he writes old stories whose meaning may already be partly distant. The Anunnaki enter this room not as a sudden supernatural spectacle, but as names inside a system. Their names appear in lists, hymns, myths, and theological arrangements. In some traditions, they are great gods associated with authority and judgment. In others, their identity overlaps with other divine groups, and later texts reshape their role. Scholars still debate how consistently the term should be understood across periods, because Mesopotamian religion changed for more than 2,000 years. That uncertainty is important. It keeps the tablet from becoming a simple codebook. The Anunnaki are not a single modern category with a fixed definition. They are part of a living, changing religious memory. A name can travel across centuries. A divine title can gather new meanings. A school text can preserve an older idea while placing it inside a newer worldview. So when people ask whether the Anunnaki feared human memory, the responsible answer begins softly. The texts do not hand us that sentence in plain form. They give us patterns. They show divine counsels. They show decisions about humanity. They show gods irritated by human noise, concerned with order, and involved in deciding who may hold kingship, wisdom, and destiny. The fear is not written like a confession. It is suggested by structure in the archive. That structure is everywhere. Lists decide what belongs with what. Divine genealogies decide who comes before whom. Royal inscriptions decide which king deserves remembrance. Temple records decide which labour matters enough to count. School tablets decide which old compositions survive by being copied again and again. Memory becomes architecture. A curious fringe reading begins from that observation. Some modern interpreters have wondered whether the Anunnaki stories preserve a distorted memory of beings who controlled knowledge before ordinary human societies could write it down. This should be treated carefully, because mythology is not the same as documentary history. Yet the idea remains compelling to some because the myths do describe divine beings organising labour, granting civilization, withholding certain powers, and deciding what humans can bear. The ancient scribe would not call it a fringe theory. He would probably call it dangerous confusion, then make you copy a word list until your wrist hurt. There is room for gentle humour here, because scribal schools were not dreamy sanctuaries of poetic wisdom. They were strict. Some school texts describe students being beaten for poor work, lateness, bad posture, or mistakes. A student learned that signs mattered because authority mattered. The world had an order, and the tablet trained the mind to obey it. That is another subtle clue. Writing did not only record thought, it shaped thought. A child learning cuneiform also learned categories of work, rank, property, divinity, and time. The hand learned the sign, the mind learned the world. When memory becomes a curriculum, it can preserve the past while quietly teaching people how to interpret it. You move deeper into the temple's inner spaces. The air smells of clay, wool, oil, and faint smoke. Somewhere, a jar is sealed. Somewhere, a priest chants words that have been repeated so many times they feel older than the voice speaking them. Somewhere, a tablet is turned over, and a student begins the reverse side. On one side, ordinary life. On the other, a god's name. That closeness is one of Mesopotamia's great secrets. The sacred did not float far above the practical world. It entered grain measures, boundary stones, offerings, contracts, city plans, and kingship. If memory was sacred, it was also administrative. If the gods ruled, they ruled through systems. And the Anunnaki, in many traditions, belong to that sense of system. They gather, they judge. They belong to ranks of divine power. They are invoked in stories where cosmic order must be maintained. In later Akkadian materials, great gods deliberate over human fate, and the assembly of gods can feel almost like a court. The image is strange, because it turns heaven into something recognizable, a council, a hierarchy, a chamber of decisions. That may be why the idea of feared memory feels so haunting. A ruler does not fear silence. Silence is easy. A ruler fears an alternate record. If humans could remember a beginning outside the approved order, then memory itself became a rival archive. Not rebellion with weapons, not conquest with armies. Something quieter, a story whispered across generations, carried through flood, migration, school, temple, and broken clay. The scribe beneath the temple does not know he is preserving a mystery for you. He writes because his teacher demands accuracy. He writes because the temple needs accounts. He writes because old compositions must be copied. He writes because civilization has made memory into labour. Yet his small tablet outlives him. It outlives the teacher, the city officials, the priestly voices, the king's boast, the sealed storeroom, and the god statue when enemies or time finally carry it away. The archive collapses, the roof falls, dust enters, the clay sleeps. But not completely. Pressed into the surface is the old human bargain. You may serve, you may obey, you may build canals and temple, you may repeat the names given to you. But you may also remember, the gods of Mesopotamia do not always arrive in thunder. Sometimes they arrive in records. A name appears in a list. A divine title is copied beside another. A hymn gives one god a city, another god a temple, another god a domain of sky, water, writing, healing, war, or judgment. Slowly, the divine world becomes mapped like a kingdom. It has ranks, offices, duties, assemblies, messengers, gatekeepers, and boundaries. You begin to sense why the Anunnaki feel so different from the soft idea of distant spirits. They belong to a world where order is never abstract. Order is measured in grain, marked in clay, assigned to officials, sung in hymns, and guarded by ritual. The same imagination that arranged fields and canals also arranged heaven. The divine realm was not vague light. It was authority given structure. In many Mesopotamian traditions, great gods meet in assembly to decide matters of fate. The image is oddly familiar. A council gathers, a decision is made, a decree passes from divine speech into earthly consequence. Kingship descends, a city is favoured, a flood is sent, a human role is established. This is not a modern office, of course, yet the comparison is hard to ignore. Gods behave, at times, like administrators of existence. They govern domains, they delegate labour, they enforce boundaries. They hold powers known in Sumerian as divine decrees or sacred attributes, often connected with civilization itself. These powers could include kingship, priesthood, wisdom, crafts, writing, music, and the patterns that made society recognizable. That detail is quietly strange. In ordinary myth, a god might create mountains or command storms. In Mesopotamian thought, divine order also includes accounting, weaving, lamentation, sexual union, kingship, and scribal skill. Civilization is not treated as merely human invention. It is something granted, arranged, and controlled through divine authority. If memory belongs anywhere in that system, it does not belong outside power. You walk, in the mind, through a city at the edge of dusk. The streets are narrow. Mud brick walls hold the day's heat. Donkeys shift near storage areas. Clay ceilings dry beside doorways. The temple rises above low houses, not as a delicate ornament, but as a heavy fact. Its terraces and walls organize the city's attention. Inside such a world, to remember is not simply to think about the past. To remember is to know where you stand. You know your household, your debts, your city god, your king, your obligations, your dead, your festivals, your inherited stories. Memory ties you to the system. It tells you what is sacred, who rules, which boundary matters, which name must be spoken correctly, and which beginning explains why things are as they are. This is where the Anunnaki become unsettling. They are often associated with the deep structure of divine authority. In some texts, they sit among the great gods. In others, they are connected with judgment, sometimes even with the underworld. Their role is not identical across all traditions, and scholars remain cautious about flattening centuries of religious development into one neat meaning. Still, the pattern remains. The Anunnaki are not minor decorative spirits. They belong to the weight of cosmic order. When their names appear, the world feels governed by powers older than any single human life. And when human beings appear in these stories, they often appear inside a system already operating before they understand it. That is a quiet attention peak. Humans arrive late to a world already administered. Some creation traditions suggest people are fashioned to take over labour from lesser gods. This theme appears most clearly in later Akkadian compositions, where divine workers complain and humanity is made to bear toil. The story is not exactly Sumerian in every form, and its versions differ, yet it belongs to the broader Mesopotamian imagination, where human life is tied to service, burden, and the maintenance of divine order. The human being, in that reading, is not made to rule the universe. The human being is made to keep it running. A cautious fringe interpretation steps into this image and asks whether these myths preserve a memory of engineered social order, not in the modern mechanical sense necessarily, but in the symbolic sense of humans being shaped for a role. Some take this further, imagining the Anunnaki as beings who altered humanity, managed knowledge, and feared independent memory. That stronger reading is speculative, and the tablets do not permit certainty. But the mythic structure does raise a softer question. If humans were made for labour within divine order, what happens when they remember more than their assigned purpose? A worker who remembers only duty remains useful. A servant who remembers origin becomes complicated. A city that remembers only its current god remains stable. A culture that remembers older gods, older floods, older kings, and older arrangements becomes harder to govern with a single story. The ancient records themselves seem aware of this tension. Mesopotamian kings often present their rule as restored order, not novelty. They build temples according to old plans. They claim favour from ancient gods. They recover sacred foundations. They repair what was damaged. Their power depends not merely on force, but on memory shaped into legitimacy. This does not mean they invented every memory. It means memory was political. You feel the cool touch of a cylinder seal in your palm. It is small enough to hold, yet it carries a world. When rolled across wet clay, it leaves a scene, a worshipper before a god, a heroic figure, an animal, a symbol, a name. A seal is identity, authority, an image in motion. It says this belongs to someone. This action has weight. This person is recognized. Now imagine memory working like that. Rolled across generations, it leaves repeated impressions. A god in assembly, a king receiving authority, a flood before the present world, a sage bringing knowledge, a divine decree governing civilization. Each impression may change slightly, but the pattern remains recognizable. The debate begins when we ask what the pattern means. Mainstream scholarship reads these myths as theological, literary, political, and cultural expressions from complex ancient societies. That reading is essential. It respects language, context, genre, and the long development of Mesopotamian religion. It prevents easy fantasies from swallowing difficult evidence. Yet responsible scholarship also admits incompleteness. Many tablets are broken. Many compositions survive in later copies. Many myths existed in versions now lost. Some stories known to ancient audiences reached us only in fragments, excerpts, or echoes. We often hold the ending without the beginning, or the beginning without the reason it mattered. That incompleteness is not an invitation to claim anything. It is an invitation to listen carefully. The Anunnaki, as administrators of order in the mythic imagination, may not have feared human memory like a frightened person fears danger. Instead, their stories may preserve an ancient anxiety about memory escaping its proper channels. Knowledge could be given through ritual, kingship, and scribal training. It could be preserved in temples. It could be attached to gods and cities. But memory outside control could become another kind of power. The old city understands this instinctively. A wrong boundary remembered by the wrong family can start a dispute. A forgotten oath can break a household. A rival genealogy can challenge a king. A hidden tablet can preserve a claim long after witnesses die. Memory is useful. Memory is dangerous. As the last light fades over mud brick walls, temple lamps begin to glow. The city quiets, but does not sleep all at once. A scribe carries a tablet towards storage. A priest checks offerings. A labourer rinses mud from his hands near a canal. Above them, the stars gather in fixed patterns. watched by people who believed heaven and earth spoke to one another through signs. Somewhere in that ordered world, the Anunnaki sit in imagination as powers of decree. They measure, they judge, they assign, they remember, and perhaps, in the oldest human unease, they are also remembered by the very beings whose memory was never meant to wander too far. The first cities do not look sudden when you stand inside them. They look accumulated. A wall is repaired with fresh mud brick over older brick. A shrine grows from a smaller sacred place. A canal is cleared where water has always wanted to wander. A courtyard becomes a storage room. A storage room becomes an archive. A family house leans against another house, and slowly, almost quietly, settlement becomes city. Yet from far away, in the long view of history, the rise of Sumer can still feel abrupt. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, and other names emerge from the deep alluvium of southern Mesopotamia like islands of memory. Some had roots stretching through earlier prehistoric settlement phases. Some became famous for temples, rulers, scribes, or sacred authority. None appeared from nothing, but each carried the feeling of a threshold crossed. At some point, human life became dense enough to require more than memory alone. The field had to be measured. The canal had to be assigned. The worker had to receive rations. The offering had to be counted. The temple had to know what entered and what left. The city's body grew too large for speech to hold by itself, so clay began to carry the weight. You feel the white heat of noon on a mud brick wall. A reed mat throws a striped shadow across the ground. Somewhere, wet clay is being kneaded for tablets. Somewhere else, workers lift baskets of earth from a canal bank, their feet sinking into soft silt. The river gives life, but only if disciplined. Water must be guided, divided, argued over, and remembered. That is one grounded explanation for early administration. Cities needed records because cities create complexity. The earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia was strongly tied to accounting and management. Tokens, sealings, numerical signs, and early tablets show a world learning to make obligation visible. Before literature could preserve the gods in long narrative form, clay was already preserving quantities: sheep, grain, beer, labour, simple words, heavy meanings. A curious thought rises gently from that practicality. If writing began with accounts, then the first durable human memory was not poetry, but obligation. Civilization first wrote down who owed what, who received what, and what had been measured. The human past entered clay through numbers before it entered clay through myth. That makes the Anunnaki question sharper. If divine order and city administration grew together, then memory did not simply preserve old stories. It helped build authority in real streets, over real bodies, with real food. A temple record was not abstract. It shaped who ate, who worked, who served, who offered, and who belonged. In Eridu, later tradition remembered extreme antiquity. The site was associated with Enki, a god of wisdom, fresh waters, craft, and cleverness. Archaeology shows long occupation and temple development there, with layers of rebuilding suggesting deep, sacred continuity. The city became more than a place. It became a memory of beginnings. Eridu matters because beginnings are powerful. A city that can claim ancient sacred origin gains depth. Its god seems older. Its rituals seem more legitimate. Its priests become guardians of a memory that reaches farther than ordinary households can verify. When later people looked back to Eridu, they were not only looking at bricks, they were looking at the idea of firstness. But firstness is difficult to prove. Scholars debate how to connect archaeological layers with later mythic claims. A sacred building can be old without proving every story told about it. A tradition can preserve memory while reshaping it. A city can become symbolically first even if other settlements were also ancient. The evidence is real, but its meaning remains layered. That uncertainty does not weaken the mood. It deepens it. You walk near a canal at evening. The water smells of reeds, silt, and animal life. Insects sing in the warm air. A low building glows with lamplight. Beyond it, a temple platform rises above the settlement, built of the same earth as the houses, but treated as something far more than earth. Inside such cities, gods were not distant decorations. They owned land. They received offerings. They had statues washed, clothed, fed, and honoured. Their presence was maintained through ritual care. To serve the temple was to serve the cosmic order made local. The Anunnaki, in this setting, belong to a memory of powers behind the visible city. They are not merely characters in stories told for entertainment. They stand near the deep structure of authority, the descent of kingship, the establishment of destinies, the maintenance of boundaries between divine and human roles. Even when not named in every local cult, the wider divine order they represent presses against the city's self-understanding. A fringe-leaning reading asks whether early cities felt so sudden because they carried inherited knowledge from an older, partly forgotten phase. Some point to mythology of wisdom figures, pre-flood kings, or divine instruction as hints of a memory older than urban history. This remains speculative, and archaeology does not require lost instructors to explain urban development. People are inventive. Mud, water, hunger, trade, conflict, and cooperation can build complexity over time. Still, myths have their own kind of persistence. They often remember in symbols what cannot be preserved in survey reports. If a tradition says kingship descended from heaven, the historian does not need to accept it literally to ask why authority required a heavenly origin. If a city remembered divine instruction, one may ask what kind of knowledge felt too important to be merely human. That is where the quiet unease returns. The first cities did not only organize labour, they organized memory. They told people where the world began, which gods mattered, which rituals sustained life, and which rulers stood inside the approved chain of order. To remember outside that chain might be to stand outside the city's meaning. You place your hand against a sun-warmed brick. It is rough, dry, and slightly crumbly at the edge. Someone shaped it long ago in a wooden mould. Someone carried it. Someone laid it into a wall. The brick is ordinary, but the wall it joins may surround a temple precinct, a storehouse, a school, or a place where records sleep. Civilization is made from ordinary things arranged into extraordinary dependence. A reed becomes a stylus, mud becomes a tablet, grain becomes wages, a name becomes authority, a myth becomes memory, a temple becomes the centre around which a city learns to see itself. This is the problem of early Sumer. Its achievements are understandable, yet still haunting. We can trace agriculture, settlement, irrigation, trade, craft specialization, accounting, and writing. We can name cities and study their remains, but we cannot fully recover how it felt for people to realize that memory itself could be external, stored, copied, and used after the speaker died. That realization may have changed everything. A human community with only oral memory can forget in human ways. It can soften stories, blend names, adjust details, and allow silence to close over discomfort. A literate temple can preserve selected memories with sharper edges. It can keep accounts no debtor once remembered. It can keep royal claims alive. It can keep divine decrees in circulation. And it can preserve myths of beings who once arranged the world before humans understood the arrangement. At night, the city sounds smaller. Dogs move between walls. A jar cools near a doorway. The temple platform darkens against a sky bright with stars. Somewhere, a child repeats a god's name without knowing its full history. Somewhere, an older person remembers a story told in a different version. The city holds both, official memory and living memory, temple memory and household memory, written memory and whispered memory, the kind that feeds authority and the kind that slips through it. If the Anunnaki feared anything in the human mind, perhaps it was not memory itself, but memory becoming plural, more than one beginning, more than one version, more than one way to ask who arranged the world and why humanity was placed within it. The tablet that lists the kings does not behave like a simple record. At first, it seems almost orderly. City follows city. Ruler follows ruler. Kingship moves from one place to another, as though authority were a sacred object passed between hands. Eridu appears, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, Sipa, Shurapak, and other names that seem to rise from a landscape half archaeological, half remembered. The shape feels official, even ceremonial. Then you see the reign lengths. Some kings rule for thousands of years, not decades, not generations, thousands. The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest surviving texts from ancient Mesopotamia. It was copied in different versions, and scholars study it as a political, literary, and ideological composition rather than a straightforward chronicle. It does preserve names of some historical rulers, especially in later portions, yet its earlier sections reach into a mythic time where kingship descends from heaven and reigns stretch far beyond ordinary human life. That is the quiet shock of it. A document shaped like history opens like myth. You sit in the dim light of a tablet room and look at the signs as if they were small locked doors. The scribe who copied them did not necessarily think like a modern historian. He was not trying to separate fact, legend, theology, and political memory into neat shelves. He inherited a tradition in which kingship was sacred, cities had destinies, and the past could be arranged to explain the present. Still, those impossible ages remain. Modern scholars usually understand them as symbolic, dialogical, or literary. Extremely long reigns may communicate divine favour, cosmic antiquity, or the grandeur of a time before ordinary history. They may help separate the pre-flood world from the human world known to later cities. They may express that early kingship belonged to an age closer to the gods, where time itself felt different. But the tablet never pauses to explain. It simply lists. That is what makes it so effective. It does not shout. It does not defend itself. It places impossible numbers beside city names with the calm confidence of administration. The result is almost more unsettling than an obvious fairy tale. It feels like a clerk has recorded a dream in the language of government. You breathe in the dry smell of old clay. Outside the imagination of the archive, the cities named in the list draw you back toward the alluvial plain. Eridu with its aura of beginnings, Shurapak with its flood associations, Kish with its political weight, Uruk with its immense urban presence. These were not random names floating in fantasy. Many belong to real places, excavated, mapped, debated, and studied. That mixture matters. The list joins known geography with impossible time. It does not give you pure invention. It gives you a braid of memory, legitimacy, theology, and perhaps older oral tradition. Some rulers in the list are difficult to verify. Some later rulers connect with historical evidence. The text crosses from mythic duration into more recognizable political memory without drawing a bright line for you. The boundary is blurred. That blur is one of the most important clues in the story of human memory. If the Anunnaki feared memory, one cautious reading might suggest they feared this very blur, the place where humans refuse to forget the strange ages, even when later order prefers cleaner history. The king list says kingship came down from heaven before the flood. After the flood, kingship comes down again. The pattern implies rupture, survival, and restoration. Something is lost. Something continues. A curious fringe interpretation sees these long reigns as echoes of non-human rulers, advanced beings, or altered lifespans remembered through myth. This reading remains outside mainstream scholarship, and the text itself cannot be used as proof of such claims. Yet it persists because the list speaks in administrative form while describing a world that does not fit ordinary human chronology. It looks like history wearing a mask, or perhaps myth wearing a clerk's robe. The more grounded question is still fascinating. Why would ancient scribes preserve such enormous reign lengths at all? They knew ordinary human lifetimes. They saw old age, illness, inheritance, and death. They recorded loans, marriages, disputes, and labour. They were not confused about human scale, so when they copied reigns of tens of thousands of years, they were preserving a different kind of truth. Not modern factual truth, cultural truth, sacred truth, political truth, memory truth. The early kings become less like individuals and more like pillars holding up the idea of an ordered world. Their immense reigns create distance. They tell the listener that the beginning was not like the present. Before the flood, kingship belonged to an age beyond normal measure. Time was larger, authority was closer to heaven. Memory had to stretch until it almost broke. You can feel that stretch in the tablet. A normal reign belongs to history. An impossible reign belongs to origin. The open scholarly debate lies in how much older tradition sits beneath the written form. The king list survives in copies from later periods, but the traditions it uses may be earlier. Some scholars emphasize its political purpose, especially its attempt to present kingship as a single institution passing from city to city. Others ask how oral traditions, local memories, and older flood stories shaped its early portions. The evidence is incomplete, and the tablet gives no private confession of its method. It only leaves the sequence: city, king, reign, then flood, then kingship again. That pause around the flood is important. The flood divides remembered time into before and after. In many cultures, flood stories mark the edge of a world that cannot be fully recovered. Mesopotamian flood traditions appear in several compositions, including stories connected with figures like Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim. These stories differ, but they share the sense that catastrophe interrupts human continuity. Yet memory survives the waters. That is the quiet attention peak. If the flood was meant to erase, the tablets say it failed. The city names before the flood remain. The kings remain. The idea that kingship had descended from heaven remains. Even if those memories are symbolic, their survival is meaningful. A culture remembered that there had been a before, not just a vague earlier time, but a named order, with named cities and named rulers. This makes the Anunnaki mystery more delicate. In traditions where divine beings decide human fate, send floods, or maintain cosmic order, memory across catastrophe becomes a kind of resistance. Not rebellion with anger, not refusal with raised hands. Something softer and more persistent. A name copied after destruction. A list repeated in school. A flood survivor telling what should have vanished. The old tablet does not say the gods feared this, but it shows why divine order might find it troublesome. A population that remembers only after the flood accepts a restored world. A population that remembers before the flood possesses a second horizon. It can compare, it can wonder, it can ask whether the present order is original or merely the surviving version. That question is gentle but dangerous. As night settles over the scribble room, the king list becomes less a record of rulers than a record of memory's stubbornness. The impossible ages no longer feel like mistakes. They feel like markers set around a forbidden depth. They tell you that ancient people did not imagine the past as shallow. They imagined it as vast, layered, broken, and partly unreachable. A lamp flame bends near the wall. The tablet remains still. It has carried cities through fire, burial, translation, doubt, and museum silence. Its numbers may not be literal, but they are not empty. They preserve the feeling that humanity once stood closer to a beginning it could no longer explain, and perhaps that was enough to trouble any power that preferred the beginning to stay quiet. The flood does not begin with water, it begins with a decision. In Mesopotamian stories, catastrophe often arrives through divine counsel before it reaches the human world. The gods speak before rivers rise. A decree forms before rain darkens the sky. Somewhere beyond ordinary hearing, the fate of cities, fields, animals, and people is weighed. Then the world below receives the consequence. This is one reason the flood traditions feel so quietly disturbing. They do not describe disaster as random weather alone. They imagine disaster as part of a moral, cosmic, or administrative crisis. Human life has become too loud, too numerous, too troublesome, or too difficult to contain. The exact reason changes across texts, but the emotional shape remains. The divine world becomes unsettled by human presence. You stand at the edge of Shuruppak in the mind, where tradition places a survivor of the Great Flood. The city rests near the riverine world of southern Mesopotamia in a landscape of mud brick, canals, reed beds, livestock, and low horizons. The air is warm and heavy. Water is life here, but also threat. It can feed a field or erase a village. That double nature matters. In Mesopotamia, floods were not abstract symbols invented by people who had never feared rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates could shift, overflow, and reshape the plain. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at some ancient sites, though not one single layer proving a universal deluge across all cities. That leaves scholars cautious. The great flood stories may preserve memories of real regional disasters, shaped through myth into a cosmic event. The evidence is incomplete. The story is powerful anyway. In the Sumerian flood tradition, the figure Ziusudra survives. In the Akkadian Atrahasis story, a wise man receives warning. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he escaped destruction and gained a strange kind of immortality. These figures differ across texts, languages, and periods, but they stand at the same threshold. They remember what the waters tried to remove. This is the quiet attention peak of the flood. The survivor is not only saved from death, he becomes an archive with a heartbeat. That idea changes everything. If a flood destroys cities, stores, names, records, boundaries, and ordinary witnesses, then the survivor carries more than fear. He carries continuity. He knows there was a before. He knows the world after the flood is not the first world, only the world that remained. A cautious reading might suggest that this is where divine fear and human memory meet most clearly. The gods may send destruction, the flood may swallow fields and roofs, yet one human remembers the divine decision, the warning, the vessel, the loss, and the return. The event meant to reset the world becomes the event preserved in story. Memory escapes on a boat. You can hear rain striking reeds, not violently in the telling, but steadily, like fingers on a roof. Water gathers in channels, then overflows them. Animals cry in the distance. Clay walls soften. The familiar edges of the city lose their certainty. A doorway becomes a dark rectangle above rising water. A courtyard becomes a pool. A field becomes shining emptiness beneath a grey sky. The ancient listener would not need special effects to understand this terror. Mud brick melts when water stays too long. The flood stories belong to a world where civilization is always negotiating with water. Canals require maintenance. Levees fail. Irrigation brings fertility, but also salinity and dispute. To live there is to understand that order must be rebuilt again and again. A city is not only founded, it is continually rescued from mud, weeds, silt, and forgetting. That is why the flood is not merely an ending. It is a test of transmission. What survives? A name? A boat? A warning? A divine secret? A pattern? The idea that some knowledge was given quietly to one person, while the broader world remained unaware, in Atrahasis. The god Enki uses a clever method to warn the hero without directly violating the divine assembly's decision. He speaks to a wall, and the human overhears. This detail is strange and beautiful. A god tells a secret by pretending not to tell it. There is no need to force the scene into modern certainty. Mainstream readings see it as a literary device expressing divine cleverness, conflict among gods, and the survival of wisdom through indirect speech. Yet the image also nourishes fringe speculation. Some have wondered whether such stories preserve a memory of restricted knowledge passed to chosen humans before a great collapse. Again, the evidence must be handled gently. A mythic warning is not proof of hidden technology. A flood survivor is not proof of a lost global civilization. Still, the story's emotional logic remains clear. Certain knowledge saves. Certain knowledge is not shared with everyone. Certain knowledge survives catastrophe because it passes through a narrow human channel. A wall hears, a man listens, a world changes. Scholars continue to debate the relationship among the Mesopotamian flood traditions and later flood stories from neighbouring cultures. Some elements likely travelled, adapted, and transformed through scribal and oral transmission. The similarities are notable, but the differences are equally important. Each version reshapes the flood to fit its own theology, language, and moral imagination. That is how memory behaves. It does not move like a sealed jar. It moves like water through reeds. It splits, returns, carries sediment, leaves traces, and changes the banks it touches. By the time a story reaches a later audience, it may still carry old particles from an earlier flood, even if the river has changed course. In the quiet after the rain, the survivor steps onto changed ground. The smell is not clean. It is wet clay, broken wood, drowned ash, animal musk, and the sour breath of disturbed earth. Silence does not feel peaceful at first. It feels stunned. A bird crosses the sky. A piece of reed mat floats against a wall. The city is no longer arranged for human meaning. Yet memory begins arranging it again. The survivor names what happened. He makes offerings. He tells the story. The gods respond in different ways depending on the version. Some are regretful. Some are hungry for offerings. Some are angry that a human survived. Some accept the new order. These divine reactions are not simple, and that complexity gives the stories their depth. The gods are powerful, but not always calm. They decide, argue, regret, conceal, reveal, and negotiate. This makes the divine world feel less like perfection and more like authority under pressure. In that pressure, the human witness becomes dangerous. He has seen the council's consequences. He knows destruction was not only weather. He carries the memory of divine disagreement. This may be one reason the Anunnaki question echoes around flood traditions. The great gods may govern destiny, but human memory preserves the record of governance. It remembers not only the command, but the flaw, the hesitation, the secret kindness, the unintended survival. A perfectly controlled world would leave no witness outside the decree. Flood myth leaves one. One is enough. After the waters withdraw, kingship returns in the old lists. Cities rise again. Fields are measured again. Temples receive offerings again. Scribes copy again. The world is restored, but restoration is not innocence. It carries a scar inside its story. People after the flood do not simply live after destruction. They live after remembered destruction. That is a different condition. It means every temple brick, every canal line, every royal claim, every divine hymn exists under the shadow of a prior world. The present order may be sacred, but it is not untouched. It is rebuilt on silence, mud, and surviving speech. So the oldest fear may not be that humans would remember every fact. Facts decay. The deeper fear may be that humans would remember the pattern, that worlds can be made, judged, broken, and remade while a single story crosses the water. That memory need not be complete to be powerful, that even fragmentary recollection can trouble official beginnings. You watch the river move in darkness. Its surface reflects a few pale stars. The current looks calm now, almost gentle. Along the bank, clay softens beneath your feet. Somewhere, a survivor's story begins to harden into tradition. Somewhere, a scribe not yet born will press it into a tablet, and the flood, meant to close a world, becomes the very reason that world is not entirely forgotten. The human being in Mesopotamian myth is rarely created for leisure. That is one of the first strange things you notice. In many later religious traditions, humanity stands near the center of creation. People are made to worship, rule, choose, suffer, learn, or reflect divine image. Mesopotamian stories are often more practical, almost brutally so. Humans are made because work must be done. Ditches must be cleared. Fields must be tended. Offerings must be prepared. The divine world has a labour problem, and humanity becomes the solution. It is not flattering. It is useful. In the Atrahasis tradition, lesser gods toil and complain. Their burden becomes unbearable. A divine decision follows, and human beings are created to take up the work. The details are complex and versions vary, but the basic movement is clear. The human role is tied to labour, maintenance, and service within an order already established by powers greater than themselves. You stand in a field before sunrise. The mud is cool beneath bare feet. Reeds rustle along the canal. Someone has opened a water gate, and a narrow stream slides into the channel with a soft, urgent sound. The smell of wet earth rises before the sun appears. Soon the heat will come. Soon backs will bend. Soon grain, mud, sweat, and duty will fill the day. This is not an abstract theology. It is daily life turned into myth. The people who copied these stories knew labour intimately. They knew the temple economy depended on work measured and repeated. They knew cities survived through irrigation, storage, craft, transport, sacrifice, and record-keeping. A myth saying humans were created to bear labour may sound harsh, but it reflects a civilization built around organised effort. Then another question begins to stir. If humans were made to work, why were they also given memory? A worker can obey without knowing the oldest stories. A labourer can carry baskets without reciting divine genealogies. A servant can bring offerings without remembering a world before the flood. Yet Mesopotamian culture preserved long traditions, elaborate myths, hymns, laments, omen texts, lexical lists, and royal histories. The human mind was not treated as a simple tool. It was trained to carry worlds. That is the tension at the centre of this mystery. Humanity is described as made for service, yet human memory becomes one of civilization's strongest powers. It stores divine names. It preserves rituals. It compares kings. It recognizes disasters. It repeats forbidden edges of the past, even when those edges are softened by poetry. A small attention peak waits here. The same beings made to relieve divine labour became the beings who remembered divine weakness. The gods in these myths are powerful, but they are not always beyond need. They complain of work. They hunger for offerings. They gather to solve problems. They disagree. They regret decisions. The human servant, created within this system, becomes witness to the system's cracks. That witness may be symbolic, literary, and theological, but it is still remarkable. Memory lets the servant see the master's dependence. Without humans, temples fall silent, offerings cease, names go unspoken, stories stop circulating, clay tablets remain unwritten. In Mesopotamian religion, the gods do not need human beings in a modern emotional sense, but the cultic relationship matters deeply. Divine presence in a city depends on ritual care. Statues must be tended, meals must be offered, festivals must be performed. The servant sustains the sacred order. That makes the servant less simple than the myth first suggests. You enter a temple courtyard at dawn. The air carries incense, animal warmth, grain dust, and oil smoke. A priest moves quietly with a vessel. An attendant prepares food for divine offering. A scribe notes goods received. The god's household is alive with human hands. The divine world may command, but the visible maintenance is human. This is where a cautious mystery reading begins to take shape. Some modern interpreters wonder whether the Anunnaki stories preserve an anxiety that humanity might become more than intended, not necessarily stronger, not necessarily rebellious in a violent sense, more aware, more capable of remembering the bargain beneath the ritual. That interpretation remains speculative. The tablets do not say humanity was designed with an explicit memory limit. They do not give us a neat statement of divine fear. Yet the myths repeatedly place humans inside a controlled relationship with divine power, while also preserving stories of divine dependence, conflict, and secrecy. That pattern invites reflection. It may be that memory is the one tool that exceeded its first purpose. A canal worker remembers the river's moods. A mother remembers a child's name after burial. A priest remembers the correct words for a ritual. A scribe remembers old signs from a language no longer spoken in the street. A city remembers that kingship once belonged elsewhere. A culture remembers a flood before the present world. Memory begins as survival. Then it becomes identity. Then it becomes comparison. Comparison is where danger enters. If you remember only your assigned place, you obey the shape of the world. If you remember another arrangement, you can imagine that the present one is not eternal. This does not require open rebellion. It only requires a quiet inner space where official order is no longer the only possible order. That inner space may be what power fears most. Not anger, not noise. A remembered alternative, mainstream history gives this idea a grounded frame. Ancient institutions often shaped collective memory to support authority. Kings used inscriptions to present themselves as chosen, ancient, victorious, and pious. Temples preserved ritual continuity. Scribal schools transmitted approved texts. None of this is unique to Mesopotamia. Every civilization manages memory in some way. The Mesopotamian case feels especially old because writing lets us watch the process near its beginnings. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns how much of these creation traditions reflects popular belief. Temple theology, scribal literary play, or inherited oral memory. A myth copied in a school may not represent the exact beliefs of a farmer. A royal inscription may not represent village storytelling. A theological text may preserve older motifs inside a new intellectual frame. Human memory was never one thing. It was divided by class, profession, city, language, and ritual access. The scribe's memory differed from the shepherd's. The priest's memory differed from the merchant's. The king's memory was carved for public endurance. The old woman's memory remained in speech, song, and silence. Yet all of them belong to humanity. This plurality may have made memory impossible to fully govern. Clay could standardize one version, but not every whisper. Temple ritual could preserve one order, but households carried griefs and stories outside official archives. A king could boast of restoring ancient foundations, but people might remember the cost in labor, taxes, and sons taken for service. The gods, imagined through human culture, inherit this unease. They can assign a role, but the human mind wanders around the role. It asks where the order began. It remembers old waters. It notices that gods need offerings. It hears that divine councils disagreed. It wonders why wisdom is sometimes given secretly, through walls, dreams, signs, or chosen figures. A reed stylus presses into clay. A line becomes permanent enough to outlive the hand. This is the miracle and the problem. Human memory is no longer only held in flesh. It can become external, portable, copied, hidden, buried, recovered. A story can sleep for centuries, then wake in the hands of someone born after the language has died. A command can be forgotten by the living, yet remain legible in dust. If the Anunnaki feared human memory, perhaps they feared this crossing from mind to material. A thought in one person can die, a thought in clay can wait. The field brightens as sunrise touches the canal. Workers move slowly into their tasks. Their world is practical, rhythmic, and heavy with necessity. Yet above the fields, the temple still rises. Within the temple, old stories still gather. Within the stories, humans are made to serve. And still quietly, they remember enough to ask why. A forbidden origin does not need to be locked behind a door. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight, copied carefully by people who no longer agree on what it means. You find it in fragments, a broken myth, a missing line, a god's name preserved beside a damaged verb, a story that begins too late because the tablet's upper edge has vanished. Ancient texts often reach modern readers like torn cloth. One panel of the pattern survives, another is gone. The mind wants to stitch the empty space, but the careful reader learns restraint. That restraint matters here. The tablets do not give a single secret book of human origins. They give many voices from many centuries. Some are Sumerian, some are Akkadian, some are preserved in later copies of older materials. Some are scholarly exercises, some are religious compositions, some are myths reshaped through long use. Each tablet offers a piece, and every piece has edges. Still, those edges can feel strangely deliberate. You sit in a lamplit room where a scribe turns a tablet over in his hands. The clay is not fully dry. Its surface holds the marks of a tradition older than the student copying it. His teacher may correct a sign, adjust a line, or insist that a divine name be written properly. In that moment, memory is not free. It passes through instruction. A story of origins is especially dangerous material. Origins explain why the world is allowed to be the way it is. They explain who serves and who commands. They explain why temples stand in the centre, why kings receive divine favour, why labour is sacred, why offerings must continue, and why human beings occupy a lower place beneath the gods. An origin story is never only about the past. It governs the present. That is why some stories may become ritualized rather than simply told. A myth can be recited at a festival, copied in a school, adapted for a temple, or attached to royal authority. Once that happens, the story is no longer loose memory. It becomes managed memory, carried through approved hands. Here the Anunnaki hover at the edge of the question. In many Mesopotamian materials, divine beings decide, assign, and structure. They do not merely witness creation. They participate in arrangements that determine human life. Later myths describe humans fashioned to relieve divine labour, and other traditions connect civilization's arts with gifts from wise powers. Together, these themes create a world where human origin is inseparable from divine administration. A quiet attention peak appears in that thought. Humanity's beginning was remembered as a decision made elsewhere, not discovered by humans, not negotiated by them, decided above them, before they could speak in their own defense. If that is only myth, it is still a powerful myth. It tells you how ancient people imagined dependence. It places human existence inside a pre-existing authority. But memory is never perfectly obedient. A tablet can preserve the official version, yet also preserve the traces of anxiety inside it. If gods create humans because labour has become unbearable, then the gods are shown needing relief. If gods send a flood because humans disturb them, then divine order appears reactive. If one god secretly warns a human, then the divine council is not fully unified. The text stabilizes power while revealing its fractures. That may be the most haunting feature of these old stories. They do not simply praise authority. They remember tension within authority. They show gods disagreeing, negotiating, hiding plans, and working around decrees. They show humanity as subordinate, yet also necessary. They show memory as ritual, but also as leakage. A cautious fringe reading sees the missing and broken portions of origin myths as hints of deliberate suppression. Some imagine that ancient priesthoods may have softened or edited older traditions about human beginnings, especially those involving divine beings, pre-flood knowledge, and restricted wisdom. This idea can be intriguing, but it should be handled gently. Damage to tablets usually comes from time, burial, reuse, fire, excavation conditions, and accident, not provable censorship. A missing line is not automatically a hidden secret, but absence still affects meaning. When a text breaks at the very point where a decision is made, your imagination leans forward. When a god's speech is damaged, the silence becomes heavy. When a creation story survives only in parts, the lost clay seems to hold more power than the surviving words. This is not because scholars ignore evidence. It is because the human mind feels the shape of incompletion. Ancient scribes also lived within completion. They copied from older tablets. They repaired traditions through repetition. They sometimes wrote colophons, short notes identifying a tablet, a series, an owner, or a scribe. These notes remind you that texts had lives. They were stored, taught, borrowed, replaced, and transmitted. A myth could survive because someone decided it was worth copying. That decision is never neutral. Imagine a temple archive deciding which compositions deserve preservation. Not in a modern committee room, but through habit, training, ritual need, and institutional memory. Some stories are copied many times. Others vanish. Some names remain familiar. Others sink into dust. Over centuries, survival itself begins to look like selection. This is one reason the origin question feels guarded. Not necessarily guarded by a conspiracy, but guarded by the ordinary filters of civilization. Fragile material, elite literacy, temple authority, scribal curriculum, political usefulness, religious caution, language change, fire, flood, war, neglect. Every filter changes what can be remembered. By the time a tablet reaches you, it has passed through a narrow gate. The open scholarly debate concerns how to read mythology as evidence. A myth can preserve ancient worldview, religious ideas, social structure, and inherited motifs. It may also contain echoes of older events, but those echoes are difficult to isolate. Scholars often disagree over how much history can be responsibly drawn from mythic narrative. That uncertainty is not a dead end. It is the atmosphere of the archive. You lift a small fragment from the table in imagination. It is no larger than a broken piece of roof tile. On it, a few signs survive. Perhaps they record an offering, perhaps part of a hymn, perhaps a line from a story whose beginning and ending are gone. The fragment seems almost useless until you remember that entire worlds often return through pieces like this. A broken tablet teaches humility. It also teaches longing. The longing is where mystery enters softly. You begin to wonder whether ancient people preserved origin stories not because they fully understood them, but because they sensed they mattered. A myth may have been copied for ritual reasons while carrying older emotional material beneath its official surface. A divine decision may have explained labour while quietly preserving discomfort about being made for labour. This discomfort is not modern invention. It breathes inside the stories themselves. Humans are noisy, useful, fragile, numerous, dependent, clever, and difficult to control. They are made from clay, blood, divine substance, or sacred mixture depending on the tradition. They are earthly, yet touched by something beyond earth. That combination gives them memory with a peculiar depth. They remember mud. They remember gods. They remember being between. Perhaps that is why origin stories had to be held carefully. To tell humans too little is to leave them rootless. To tell them too much is to let them see the machinery behind reverence. A well-managed myth gives meaning. An uncontrolled memory asks who benefits from that meaning. The scribe finishes his line. He smooths a small error with a damp finger, then presses the corrected sign again. It is a tiny act, almost tender. Yet in that gesture, the past is being shaped. A mistaken mark disappears. A proper mark replaces it. The tablet becomes cleaner than the moment that produced it. History often works like that. So does forgetting. As the lamp burns lower, the origin tablet remains unfinished to your eyes. Not because the ancient story had no ending, but because time has taken parts of it away. What survives is enough to trouble sleep. Gods who decide, humans who serve, scribes who preserve, and a memory that may have been safer when it stayed broken. Inside the temple walls, memory learns to speak softly. It does not wander through the city as room alone. It is trained, polished, repeated, corrected, and placed within the rhythm of sacred life. A hymn is not merely remembered because someone likes the sound of it. It is remembered because the god must be honoured. The rite must be performed, and the city must keep its relationship with the unseen world intact. You hear the low murmur of voices before dawn. The temple courtyard is still dark. A small lamp trembles near a doorway. Oil smoke curls upward and leaves a faint bitterness in the air. A priest moves through practiced gestures. An attendant brings water. A singer clears his throat. A scribe sits nearby, not at the centre of the ritual but close enough to belong to its shadow. The temple is not only preserving goods, it is preserving sequence. Words must come in the proper order. Offerings must arrive at the correct moment. Objects must be placed where custom says they belong. Divine names must be spoken with care. To a modern listener, repetition may sound simple, even dull. To the ancient city, repetition is how the world avoids slipping out of alignment. That is a grounded historical detail worth holding gently. Mesopotamian temples functioned as religious, economic, and cultural centres. They maintained cult statues, organised offerings, managed property, employed workers, and supported scribal activity. Their rituals created continuity between human action and divine presence. The temple did not merely remember the past, it enacted memory every day. A ritual is memory wearing motion. You watch a hand lift a vessel of water. Another hand folds cloth. A chant rises in measured syllables. The words have passed through many mouths before this one. Each repetition makes them feel older than the speaker, almost as if the voice belongs to the building itself. This is where memory becomes difficult to separate from obedience. A child may learn a story at home with warmth, variation, and laughter. A student in a temple school learns the approved version. A priest learns the words that must not be changed casually. As king commissions inscriptions that bind his name to sacred restoration. All of these are memory, but not all memory has the same freedom. The Anunnaki mystery rests quietly inside that difference. If divine beings were imagined as guardians of order, then human memory inside ritual could be safe. It repeated what the system required. It honoured the gods. It preserved hierarchy. It kept creation, kingship, labour, and destiny inside recognisable lines. Memory outside ritual was less predictable. A farmer might remember a bad tax year differently from a royal inscription. A conquered city might remember a victorious king as a destroyer, not a restorer. A widow might remember the cost of a campaign that palace records call glorious. A scribe might copy a myth faithfully, yet privately wonder why gods needed human service so badly. Quiet thoughts are hard to archive. That may be why official memory often prefers ceremonies. Ceremonies give memory a body and a path. They reduce wandering. They transform dangerous questions into sacred repetition. Instead of asking why the gods arranged human life this way, the ritual shows how to maintain the arrangement. This is not unique to Sumer. Every organised society turns some memories into ceremonies, because ceremonies make the past usable. Anniversaries, coronations, funerals, festivals, temple renewals, and foundation rites all tame time. They tell people where grief belongs, where loyalty belongs, where wonder belongs, and where silence belongs. But the Mesopotamian case is especially old and intimate. You can almost feel memory being shaped at the birth of written civilization. In the Eduba, the scribal school, students copied not only administrative forms, but also literary and religious texts. They learned old Sumerian compositions, word lists, proverbs, and hymns. Education turned selected memory into skill. Skill turned selected memory into authority. A quiet attention peak appears here. To read the past, you first had to be accepted into the people trained to read it. That fact changes the atmosphere of every tablet. Literacy was not spread evenly across society. The written archive was powerful partly because most people could not easily enter it. A clay tablet might preserve memory, but it also narrowed access. The person who could read old signs stood between the community and its older voices. A cautious fringe interpretation sees this as a memory gate. Some have wondered whether temple schools and priestly traditions preserved only approved versions of more ancient knowledge, especially stories about the gods, creation, and the flood. The idea can be tempting because elite literacy naturally creates secrecy. Yet secrecy is not always evidence of deliberate concealment. Sometimes it is simply the result of training being difficult. Cuneiform was not casual, it required years. Still, difficulty can become power. A person who controls technical memory can shape what others believe the past says. A scribe may not be inventing the old story, but he chooses a version, copies a line, corrects a sign, and places one tradition in circulation while another fades. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns how temple traditions interacted with oral traditions. Some myths may have circulated widely in spoken form before entering written texts. Others may have belonged primarily to scribal culture. Some compositions may have been performed, while others were school exercises or scholarly works. The line between living belief and learned preservation is not always clear. You sense that uncertainty in the temple walls. The walls hear more than one kind of memory. They hear formal chants and whispered errands. They hear accounts of barley and laments for destroyed cities. They hear the names of gods in polished ritual, then the tired muttering of workers carrying baskets at sunset. Sacred space is never entirely free from ordinary breath. That ordinary breath matters. It keeps the city human. Without it, the temple would become a perfect machine of repetition. But no human institution is perfect. A singer forgets a phrase. A student miscopies a line. A priest grows old. A storeroom seal cracks. A tablet falls and loses its corner. A new dynasty favours one tradition over another. A conquered city mourns under the language of restoration. Memory survives by adapting. That adaptation may be exactly what made it dangerous. If memory were fixed, authority could manage it forever. If it were entirely fluid, it would vanish too easily. Human memory is something in between. It repeats enough to endure, but changes enough to escape. It can wear the clothing of ritual while carrying older questions beneath the fabric. The Anunnaki, as powers associated with decree and order, become haunting in this context. They represent a divine world where things are assigned their places. Humans serve, kings rule, temples maintain, scribes preserve. But memory within human beings does not always remain assigned. It dreams, it compares, it misremembers in meaningful ways. A temple hymn may praise divine wisdom, while an origin myth quietly recalls divine anxiety. A royal inscription may celebrate ancient restoration, while a flood story remembers that divine decisions once nearly ended humanity. A ritual may ask people to repeat order, while the very need for repetition suggests order is never fully secure. You stand near a wall coated with old plaster. Torchlight moves across it like water. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a drum sounds once, then rests. The temple is awake now. Work begins. The city enters another day under the gaze of gods whose presence must be fed, clothed, praised, and remembered. That last word turns gently in the dark. Remembered! Even gods in the human world require memory to remain near. Their names need mouths. Their stories need scribes. Their temples need rituals. Their authority needs repetition. This does not make them powerless inside the ancient world view, but it makes the relationship more complex than simple command. The divine order depends on human remembering, and dependence always contains unease. Perhaps the oldest fear was not that humans would forget the gods. Forgetting would end the relationship, but it would also end the story. The subtler fear may have been that humans would remember them too well. Remember their counsels, their quarrels, their bargains, their need, their secrets, their attempts to shape the human mind through temple, school, and sacred word. Inside the temple walls, memory bows, but it does not disappear. The measured mind begins with a small mark in clay. A wedge points one way, then another. A number is pressed beside a commodity. A name is placed within a line. A divine sign appears before the name of a god, separating sacred presence from ordinary speech. The world becomes readable because the scribe learns how to divide it. This act seems humble at first. Then you notice how powerful it is. To measure something is to bring it into order. To name something is to make it easier to command. Remember, exchange, fear, worship, or punish. Ancient Mesopotamian writing did not merely capture language. It helped arrange reality into categories: fields, animals, workers, offerings, cities, rulers, omens, gods, and destinies could all be made part of a recorded system. The mind trained by such writing becomes careful, but also bounded. You can picture a young scribe seated near a wall at midday, squinting against the light coming through the doorway. His tablet rests on his palm. His teacher recites a list. He repeats it, presses it, checks it, and begins again. The list may include trees, professions, vessels, cities, birds, stones, divine names, or legal phrases. A list is a quiet cage. It does not imprison by force. It teaches the mind where things belong. A sheep belongs under one heading, a priest under another, a god under another. A labourer receives a ration, a king receives an inscription, a temple receives offerings, a human receives a place in the order. This is the ordinary discipline of civilization. It is also where the mystery grows more intimate. In Mesopotamian thought, divine decrees and powers were not loose abstractions. Sumerian traditions speak of sacred powers often called me, a difficult term connected with the attributes, offices, arts, and structures that make civilization function: kingship, priesthood, truth, crafts, music, lamentation, and many other cultural forms could be imagined as divine gifts or cosmic regulations. The world was not only made, it was assigned. That detail has a strange calmness to it. Civilization becomes a set of authorized patterns. If something has a place, it can be practiced. If it has a name, it can be transmitted. If it belongs to divine order, it can be guarded. The mind that remembers these patterns participates in the order, but it is also shaped by it. You feel the pressure of the stylus in your own hand. The clay resists slightly, then yields. Each sign requires discipline. The hand learns to repeat before it learns to question. The student's body becomes part of the system before the student fully understands the system's meaning. That is how memory can be measured, not by removing it, but by training its channels. A person remembers the approved list, the proper hymn, the correct title, the sacred sequence, the legal formula. Memory becomes reliable because it becomes patterned. It stops wandering as freely. The Anunnaki in this atmosphere become less like monsters of fear and more like figures of regulation. Their imagined world is one of assemblies, destinies, judgments, and cosmic roles. They belong to the sense that reality is not random, but administered through decrees older than any human choice. A quiet attention peak waits inside the word destiny. In Mesopotamian tradition, destiny could be fixed, spoken, assigned, or held by gods. To determine a destiny was not simply to predict a future. It was to establish a role within the order of things. A city, a king, a person, or even an object might stand under a fate granted by powers beyond ordinary reach. If destiny is assigned, then memory becomes delicate. A human who remembers only destiny obeys it. A human who remembers how destiny was assigned begins to look behind the curtain. That phrase is modern, but the anxiety is old. Myth often cares deeply about who holds the power to decree, name, and establish order. The tablets preserve this care. In stories of divine assemblies, decisions carry weight because they come from a gathered authority. In myths of civilization's gifts, powers are transferred, guarded, or stolen through cleverness and ritual drama. In omen traditions, trained experts read signs because the world itself is thought to carry messages. In royal inscriptions, kings claim they were chosen, named, or favoured by gods. Everything depends on correct recognition. The curious fringe tidbit comes from the way some readers interpret the divine decrees, and the Anunnaki's ordering role. They wonder whether these ideas encode memories of a structured knowledge system, perhaps one deliberately limited for humans. In stronger speculative versions, humanity receives only selected portions of wisdom, enough to serve and build, but not enough to fully understand its origin. This remains interpretation. The mainstream view is more cautious. These traditions reflect theology, ritual, political authority, and cultural imagination. They show how ancient Mesopotamians understood civilization as divinely grounded. There is no need to turn every sacred power into hidden machinery. Yet the pattern of restricted, transferred, and guarded powers is real within the mythic language. The question is what kind of reality that language preserves. Scholars continue to debate the best translations and implications of certain key terms. Words connected to wisdom, decree, fate, and divine power are difficult because they carry meanings across different contexts and periods. A term may feel clear in one hymn, then become more complex in a myth or ritual text. Translation opens a door, but never removes the room's shadows. This uncertainty is helpful. It keeps the measured mind from becoming too neat. You walk through a scribal school in the late afternoon. The heat has softened. Students press signs into clay while flies move near a jar of water. A teacher's voice cuts through the room with tired precision. A mistake is corrected. A proverb is copied. A divine name receives its proper sign. The scene feels ordinary. Yet inside this ordinary discipline, human minds are being fitted to an inherited cosmos. The student learns that the world has categories before he learns to argue with them. He learns old names before he knows why they survived. He learns to preserve forms he did not create. That is not sinister by itself. Every education does this. Every culture teaches children the world before letting them question it. The difference here is that the written evidence allows you to see how ancient and sacred this shaping felt. Memory was not only personal, it was civic, cosmic, and divine. If the Anunnaki feared human memory, one careful possibility is that they feared unmeasured memory. Memory without category, memory without ritual boundary, memory that does not know where to stop, memory that links a flood survivor to a king list, a creation myth to temple labor, a divine decree to human dependence, a forgotten city to a living question. Measured memory can serve, unmeasured memory can wander into origin. A temple system may tolerate thousands of tablets because tablets can be stored, sorted, copied, and taught. But dreams, doubts, family stories, and private comparisons move differently. They do not always obey shelves. They slip between official categories. You can feel that movement at twilight. A scribe leaves the school with clay dust on his fingers. He knows the list his teacher demanded. He also knows the joke another student whispered. He knows the hymn's sacred line. He also knows the look on a labourer's face when rations were counted too low. His mind holds both approved order and living contradiction. That mixture is human. It's also difficult to govern completely. The measured mind, then, is not a conquered mind. It is a trained mind with cracks of life running through it. The Anunnaki's imagined order may assign destinies, but human memory gathers details that destiny does not mention. Smells, faces, losses, mistakes, questions, the warmth of clay, the fear before rain, the silence after a name is removed. Those small memories matter. They make the official world less total. As the day lowers into blue shadow, the tablets cool on their shelves. Some hold numbers, some hold hymns, some hold old stories of gods deciding human fate. Together they form a measured memory of civilization. Yet somewhere beyond the tablets, another memory continues inside breath and sleep. A memory not fully listed, memory not fully assigned, a memory that still wonders who first measured the human mind, and what they hoped it would never measure back. When writing replaces the witness, memory becomes stranger than speech. A living witness can be questioned, doubted, comforted, threatened, or forgotten. A witness can grow old and change the story without noticing. A witness can soften a painful detail because the room feels too quiet. Speech is warm, flexible, and mortal. It depends on breath. Clay does not breathe. Clay waits. This is the first unsettling gift of cuneiform. Once a sign enters the tablet, it can travel beyond the body that made it. It can sit in a basket, cross a courtyard, enter a storeroom, be copied by a student, or sleep beneath collapsed brick until an excavator's hand lifts it into daylight thousands of years later. It can outlive the witness and become a different kind of witness. Not alive, but stubborn. You stand beside a small table where damp tablets lie in careful rows. Some are still soft enough to mark. Others have dried at the edges. A scribe turns one slowly, checking the reverse side. Another tablet contains a sealed record. The seal impression gives it authority, like a voice pressed into clay after the voice has left the room. The world has begun trusting marks. That change is difficult to overstate. In Mesopotamia, writing emerged from practical needs: accounting, property, administration, labour organisation, and temple management. Over time, it expanded into literature, law, ritual, astronomy, medicine, royal inscriptions, and myth. The archive became an extension of social memory. It allowed cities to remember more than any single person could hold. Yet every extension has a cost. When memory moves into writing, it becomes more durable, but also less humanly flexible. The tablet preserves a line without preserving the face of the person who spoke it. It keeps the account without the argument around it. It holds the hymn without the trembling in the singer's throat. It records the king's claim without the private disbelief of those who paid for his building. This is where official memory gains power. A clay tablet can outlast resistance. If a palace records victory, the victory becomes legible long after the defeated voices fade. If a temple records offerings, the god's estate remains visible through lists and numbers. If a school preserves a myth, that version may survive while other spoken versions vanish. Writing does not simply remember, it chooses which kinds of memory can endure materially. The open scholarly uncertainty lies in what has been lost outside writing. Ancient Mesopotamia was not only a world of scribes, it was also a world of herders, fishers, potters, brewers, mothers, migrants, servants, soldiers, singers, and children. Most of their voices did not enter tablets directly. Their memories moved through bodies, songs, work, and family speech. The archive is precious. It is also partial. This matters when you think about the Anunnaki. The written gods are the gods who passed through scribal culture. Their names, roles, and stories are preserved by trained hands. But ancient religion was also lived in gestures, household rituals, local customs, and fears not always written down. A god in a tablet may not be identical to a god in a whispered prayer at night. So the Anunnaki we meet are already shaped by survival. They are the Anunnaki who entered texts, lists, myths, theological arrangements, and later scholarly memory. Their authority reaches you because writing carried it. If there were other stories, softer or stranger or more local, they may have vanished without a trace. That absence changes the mystery. Perhaps human memory was feared not only because it could preserve too much, but because writing could preserve one version so strongly that it buried many others. A society may lose memory through forgetting, but it may also lose memory through over-selecting. Too much authority given to one archive can make other ways of remembering fade. That is a quieter form of erasure. No flames required. A curious fringe reading turns this idea toward the possibility that old myths contain traces of edited knowledge. Some imagine that priestly or royal scribes preserved divine histories in controlled forms, leaving only hints of earlier traditions about human origins and the Anunnaki. This remains speculative, and it should not be mistaken for proven censorship. But the broader point is grounded. Archives are never neutral mirrors of a whole society. They are shaped by institutions. You walk through a storeroom where tablets are sorted by type, accounts belong together, legal documents belong elsewhere. School tablets may pile up in corners. Literary works, when preserved, may reflect the curriculum of learned circles. Even disorder has a pattern, because the material comes from human systems. A tablet might say very little. Its context says more. Where was it found? Was it a school copy, a temple record, a palace archive, a private document? Was it written carefully or clumsily? Does it preserve an older composition? Does it belong to a known series? Every answer changes how the memory should be heard. The careful reader becomes almost like a night watchman. You do not seize the tablet and demand secrets. You sit beside it and notice what kind of silence surrounds it. Some silences come from broken clay, some from lost libraries, some from elite literacy, some from genre, some from the fact that a myth is not trying to answer the modern question you bring to it. Still the tablet speaks. It speaks in a voice not exactly human anymore. A witness says, "I saw." A tablet says, "It was written." That difference is powerful. A living person can be accused of error. A written object begins to look like authority, especially when it is old, formal, and difficult to read. Ancient people understood this authority. Contracts, receipts, omens or rituals, and royal inscriptions all depended on the idea that written memory could carry force. A sealed tablet could settle a matter after spoken dispute faded. A royal inscription could project a king's piety beyond his lifetime. A copied myth could bind generations of scribes to an inherited sacred world. Memory became portable authority. That is the attention peak hidden in plain clay. Once memory leaves the body, it can be stored by power. If the Anunnaki represent divine authority in the mythic imagination, then written memory becomes a human reflection of divine control. The gods decree destinies. The scribe records obligations. The gods assign roles. The tablet assigns rations. The gods preserve cosmic order. The archive preserves civic order. The pattern echoes, but the echo can turn strange. Humans learn to do in small ways what gods do in mythic ways. They name, measure, record, preserve, classify, and judge. They become makers of durable order. They create archives that outlast kings. They recover old stories and place them before new eyes. In that sense, writing may have made humans more godlike than labour alone ever could. Not immortal in body, but capable of sending memory beyond death. You feel that power in the museum quiet. A tablet rests behind glass. The scribe who pressed it is gone. His city may be gone. His god's temple may be ruined. His spoken language may no longer live on any street. Yet his marks remain. Someone reads them. Someone hears the old structure of thought stir again. The witness has vanished. The writing has not. This reversal may be the deepest irony. Human beings in the myths may be created to serve divine order, yet they become the carriers of divine memory. They remember the gods after temples fall. They recover names from ruins. They argue over translations. They revive myths that once belonged to ritual life and place them inside new questions. The Anunnaki survive because humans remember them. If there is fear in that, it is not simple fear. It is dependence turned backward. The powers that ordered human life now depend on human archives to remain imaginable. Their councils, decrees, and ancient authority reach the present only because fragile clay endured and human curiosity returned. Outside, evening settles. The archive cools. A tablet dries. A final mark stiffens into permanence. No one in the room knows which words will matter after collapse, which accounts will vanish, which myths will become famous, which names will wake again under museum light. Writing chooses. Time chooses. And sometimes, across a distance too large for any human voice, clay remembers the gods more faithfully than the gods may have wished to be remembered. Later echoes do not repeat the old songs exactly. They bend them. A divine assembly becomes a heavenly court. Ancient sages become watchers, angels, or forbidden teachers in later imagination. Flood survivors become ancestors of new worlds. Wisdom passes through strange hands. Stories migrate across languages, empires, temples, libraries, and households, until an older Mesopotamian pattern reappears wearing unfamiliar clothing. You do not need to force these echoes into sameness. That would flatten the past. The ancient Near East was a world of contact, trade, conquest, borrowing, translation, and reinterpretation. Ideas moved between Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, West Semitic, Hittite, Hurrian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and other cultural worlds in complex ways. A story could travel without remaining identical. A motif could survive after its original setting faded. A name might vanish while a structure remained. The structure is what draws your attention. Beings above humanity possess knowledge. Humans receive only portions of it. Floods mark the boundary between old and new worlds. Divine councils decide earthly fate. Certain figures cross the line between heavenly wisdom and human society. Some knowledge is treated as blessing. Some knowledge is treated as danger. This is not proof of one hidden system. It is evidence of a persistent ancient concern. You stand beneath a night sky in a later city, far from the earlier Sumerian temples, yet still under stars watched by scribes and priests. The air is cooler here. A lamp burns in a scholar's room. Scrolls and tablets belong to different technologies, but they serve a related hunger. Human beings still want to know what came before them, who arranged the world, and why some knowledge seems costly. In later Jewish apocalyptic traditions, especially texts associated with the Watchers, heavenly beings descend and teach humans skills that become morally dangerous. These traditions are not Sumerian. They arise in a different religious, linguistic, and historical context. Yet they contain a familiar unease. Knowledge from beyond the human world can unsettle human life. That is the quiet attention peak. Forbidden knowledge is not always hidden because it is false. Sometimes it is feared because it works. Metallurgy, cosmetics, weapons, astrology, enchantments, and other arts appear in some later traditions as teachings that alter human society. The moral meaning differs from Mesopotamian myth, but the anxiety feels related. When knowledge crosses the boundary too freely, the human world changes faster than its moral order can contain. This is where careful comparison becomes important. Mainstream scholarship does not simply say that later Watcher traditions are copied from Anunnaki stories. The relationship is not that direct. Cultures borrow, adapt, resist, and transform. Some similarities arise because ancient societies wrestled with similar questions. Why humans suffer, why knowledge is dangerous, why divine beings interact with mortals, and why catastrophe interrupts history. Still, echoes can be meaningful without being identical. A pattern moving across cultures may preserve shared questions rather than shared facts. Mesopotamian scribes imagined gods distributing civilization and determining destinies. Later traditions imagined heavenly beings teaching arts that became dangerous. Both traditions wonder what happens when human beings receive more than ordinary life prepared them to hold. The fringe interpretation presses harder. Some modern readers suggest that Watchers, Apkallu, Anunnaki, and other ancient figures may all preserve distorted memories of the same class of beings, remembered differently by different cultures. This idea is speculative and often goes beyond what evidence can support. It can be interesting as mythic comparison, but it should not be treated as historical certainty. A gentler reading is more useful. Ancient people repeatedly imagined civilization as something received, not merely invented. Knowledge arrives from gods, sages, ancestors, culture, heroes, or beings who stand at the edge of human life. That does not mean the stories recorded literal visitors. It means knowledge itself felt mysterious, powerful, and morally charged. You feel that charge in the image of the teacher. A figure comes from elsewhere, carrying instruction. The gift may be writing, ritual, metalwork, divination, healing, agriculture, city planning, or sacred law. At first, the gift seems beneficial. Then it creates consequences. Humans become stronger, more skilled, more restless, more responsible, and sometimes more dangerous. Knowledge changes the receiver. Memory makes the change permanent. If the Anunnaki were feared as figures tied to divine order, later echo traditions suggest another side of the same ancient anxiety. What if the danger was not only human memory of the past, but human memory of instruction? A skill once learned can be passed on. A ritual once taught can be repeated. A sign once understood can be copied. A boundary once crossed can become a road. That is how civilization advances. It is also how control weakens. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns the pathways of influence. Which motifs travel directly through scribal transmission? Which passed through oral storytelling? Which emerged independently because human societies face similar pressures? The ancient Near East was interconnected, but not every resemblance proves direct borrowing. Scholars compare language, chronology, geography, literary form, and historical context before making careful claims. That caution keeps the night air clear. You are not chasing a single secret behind every myth. You are listening for recurring concerns, divine counsels, human noise, flood survival, forbidden teaching, sages before catastrophe, knowledge that civilizes and corrupts, memory that preserves both blessing and danger. In that listening, the old Mesopotamian tablets feel less isolated. They become part of a longer human meditation on the problem of knowing. Not enough knowledge leaves humans helpless. Too much knowledge makes them difficult to govern. Knowledge without memory dies. Memory without wisdom can repeat disaster. Ancient stories rarely solve this problem. They circle it. They place it in gods, sages, floods, watchers, kings, scribes, and survivors. They ask whether humans are children, servants, partners, rebels, students, or heirs. They ask whether memory is obedience to tradition, or a door into older questions. You hear a faint sound of writing in another age. Not reed on clay this time, but ink on prepared skin, or stylus on wax, or a voice reciting under a ceiling beam. The material changes. The concern remains. Someone copies a story of beings who knew too much. Someone warns that certain arts came from above. Someone preserves a flood as boundary. Someone wonders why the human world feels inherited rather than self-made. The Anunnaki are not present by name in every echo. They do not need to be. Their old pattern of divine authority, ordered knowledge, and human dependence lingers near the edge of comparison. They belong to an early written world where gods arrange civilization and humans learn to preserve the arrangement. Later stories ask what happens when the arrangement leaks. This is where memory becomes almost luminous. A culture may forget the name of an older god but keep the fear attached to divine knowledge. It may abandon one language but keep the shape of a flood survivor. It may reject one pantheon but preserve the idea of a heavenly council. It may transform gods into angels, sages into ancestors, and decrees into laws. Memory survives by changing its clothes. At midnight, the later scholar lowers his lamp. The room falls into quiet. Outside, the city breathes in sleep. Above the roof, stars remain where ancient observers once placed signs, meanings, warnings, and stories. The heavens do not speak plainly. They never did. Humans keep trying to read them. Perhaps that is the shared anxiety beneath the echoes. Not that humans remember one forbidden fact, but that they keep building systems of memory from whatever reaches them. Clay, flood, myth, star, teacher, ruin, dream. They turn fragments into patterns. They compare patterns across generations. They ask whether the power above them were guides, rulers, judges, or something more difficult to name. And once that question enters memory, it does not stay buried. The sages come from the edge of the world. At least, that is how they feel when you meet them in the old traditions. Neither fully divine nor simply human. Neither ordinary priests nor wandering storytellers. They stand at the shoreline between memory and instruction, where civilization seems to arrive not as a slow human invention, but as a gift carried by strange figures from before the world became settled. They are known as the Apkallu. In Mesopotamian tradition, The Apkallu were wise sages associated especially with the deep wisdom of the god Enki, later known as Ea in Akkadian. They appear in lists, myths, ritual texts, and later scholarly imagination as culture bringers, protectors, and figures of ancient knowledge. Some traditions place 7 great sages before the flood, linking them to a time when wisdom stood closer to divine sources. That detail is quietly magnetic. 7 sages before the flood. You can feel why later readers pause there. The number feels arranged. The timing feels meaningful. These beings do not merely teach after civilization is stable. They appear near the origin of civilization, near the old cities, near the waters of the deep, near the boundary that the flood will later break. You stand beside the marshes of Eridu at pale dawn. The reeds are silver with moisture. Birds move low over the water. The mud holds footprints from people, animals, and something harder to name in the imagination. The temple rises from the settlement like a shaped memory, built layer upon layer over older sacred ground. In later tradition, Eridu belongs to Enki, lord of fresh waters, wisdom, craft, magic, and clever counsel. Wisdom here does not fall from the sky, it rises from the deep. The Apsu, the subterranean fresh waters associated with Enki, is not only a physical idea, it is a symbolic depth, a hidden reservoir beneath the visible world. Water feeds the city from below, just as wisdom seems to feed culture from beneath ordinary speech. The Apkallu, connected to this realm of wisdom, carry the feeling of something brought upward. This is a mainstream historical detail softened into story. Mesopotamian culture often tied wisdom, ritual expertise, and civilization's arts to divine sources. Learned professions did not always present knowledge as merely human cleverness. Knowledge had sacred ancestry. It came through gods, sages, and traditions older than the current generation. That's not unusual for ancient societies, but the Apkallu make it unusually vivid. Some were imagined in later art and ritual as hybrid figures, sometimes with fish cloaks, bird features, or other symbolic forms. They appear on protective reliefs and in ritual contexts as beings associated with purification and defense against evil. Their forms are not casual fantasy. They belong to a world where image, ritual, and power intertwine. A fish-cloaked sage is a strange sight. The image lingers because it refuses to become fully ordinary. A figure stands with a human body and an aquatic covering, carrying a bucket and a cone-like object in ritual scenes. Modern viewers often misread such images quickly, sometimes turning them into evidence of hidden machines or visitors. Care is needed. In their own context, these figures belong to Mesopotamian protective and ritual symbolism. Still, their strangeness is real. Ancient people meant them to look other than ordinary. The fringe tidbit grows from that visual otherness. Some modern interpreters have wondered whether the Apkallu preserve memories of teachers from outside normal human society, perhaps linked to the Anunnaki or to pre-flood knowledge. Strong versions of this claim move far beyond the evidence, yet the old texts and images do present sages as liminal beings, standing between divine wisdom and human culture. That liminality is enough for mystery. You do not need to turn them into modern visitors. You only need to notice how ancient memory placed wisdom in forms that were not fully human. The most important knowledge did not simply emerge from the village. It came through figures marked by distance, depth, and sacred authority. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns the development of the Apkallu tradition. Different texts describe different lists and roles. Some sages are pre-flood, some later figures, sometimes called scholars or learned men, appear after the flood. The tradition changes over time, and scholars debate how mythic sages relate to historical scribble experts, ritual specialists, and royal ideology. That debate matters. A king might claim legitimacy by linking himself to ancient wisdom. A scholar might imagine his craft as descending from primordial sages. A ritual expert might invoke Apkallu-like figures as protectors. The tradition could serve many purposes, all while preserving the feeling that knowledge once passed through extraordinary intermediaries. Memory becomes genealogy, not of blood but of wisdom. You enter a scholar's chamber in a later Mesopotamian city. Shelves hold tablets of omens, rituals, incantations, lexical lists, and commentaries. The air smells of clay dust, wax, wool, and old smoke. A learned man studies signs that ordinary people cannot read. He may see himself as part of a lineage reaching back towards sages before the flood. That self-image is powerful. It turns scholarship into inheritance. The learned person is not just smart, he is a receiver of ancient order. He becomes a human vessel for wisdom whose origin lies beyond living memory. This gives scribal culture depth, but it also creates unease. If wisdom comes from before the flood, then the present world depends on knowledge carried across a rupture, and carried knowledge is never innocent. It may preserve, it may protect. It may also remind people that the current order is not complete in itself. It owes something to a before. The sages make that before feel personal, almost embodied. They stand as memory with faces, memory with ritual hands, memory with the smell of water and old clay. Here the Anunnaki question takes another form. If great gods or divine assemblies ordered the world, and sages transmitted parts of that order to humans, then human memory becomes the storage place of selected divine knowledge. The gods may hold decrees, but sages deliver instruction. Humans receive enough to build cities, perform rituals, read omens, write tablets, and maintain temples. But what else was withheld? That question is not answered. It remains inside the gaps. Some texts suggest that after the flood, human sages or scholars continued the line of wisdom in altered form. The pre-flood Apkallu stand nearer to mythic origin, while later learned figures stand nearer to history. This creates a layered memory of decline, transmission, and survival. Wisdom does not disappear, but it changes its vessel. Before the flood are extraordinary sages. After the flood, human scholars. That transition is a quiet attention peak. It suggests a narrowing of access. Knowledge once linked to beings close to the divine becomes knowledge held by trained humans, mediated through schools, rituals, and archives. The old brightness dims, but it does not go out. You can hear the reed beds moving outside Eridu. The sound is soft, almost like whispering. Water laps against mud. A fisherman checks a net. A child watches birds rise into the morning. The scene is ordinary, but tradition places beneath it a deeper reservoir of memory. The city is not just inhabited, it is instructed. The Apkallu make civilization feel taught. Mainstream history explains cities through long processes: agriculture, settlement growth, trade, labor organization, environmental management, ritual institutions, and writing. This explanation is strong and necessary. People built these worlds with human hands, over generations, through trial, failure, and adaptation. But myth does not ask the same question in the same way. Myth asks why the work felt meaningful. Why did knowledge feel larger than the knower? Why did ritual expertise seem inherited from beings beyond normal human life? Why did wisdom before the flood matter so much that later scholars still imagine themselves in its shadow? Those questions do not cancel archaeology. They deepen the human atmosphere around it: the fish-cloaked sage, the pre-flood list, the god of deep waters, the scribal scholar, the ritual object, the city of Eridu, and the flood boundary all gather into one slow pattern. Memory is not merely storage. Memory is transmission from depth to surface, from god to sage, from sage to scribe, from tablet to sleeping listener. And somewhere in that transmission, a fear may hide. Not fear of ignorance. Ignorance is simple. Fear of partial knowledge that grows. Fear of humans receiving fragments and learning to connect them. Fear that the servant made for labour might become a keeper of old instruction, then a reader of patterns, then a questioner of origins. The Apkallu do not shout this fear. They stand quietly beside it. As dawn strengthens, the marshlight turns gold. The sage figure fades into relief, then seal, then tablet, then memory. The water keeps moving, the city keeps working. The old wisdom remains just below the surface, like fresh water under the earth. You cannot see all of it. You only know that something beneath continues to feed the roots. The ground keeps its own archive. Long before a tablet reaches a museum drawer, it lies in soil with broken walls, burnt beams, pottery sherds, animal bones, reed impressions, and seals hardened by accident. Archaeology does not recover the past as a complete story. It recovers debris with discipline. It asks where something lay, what surrounded it, how deep it was, what layer covered it, and what other objects shared its silence. That silence is important. A myth can speak in grand shapes, but a buried city speaks in fragments of use, a threshold worn by feet, a jar sunk into a floor, a child's burial beneath a house, a seal rolled across a lump of clay, a tablet discarded after practice, a brick stamped with a king's name. These things are quieter than divine councils, but they anchor the world. You step into an excavation trench at early morning. The air is pale and dry. Dust gathers on your sleeves. A line of mud brick appears in the side of the trench, almost the same colour as the soil around it. At first, it seems barely visible. Then the pattern settles into your eyes. Brick follows brick. A wall returns from the earth as if it had been waiting for someone patient enough to notice. This is how buried cities answer. Not with certainty at first. With alignment, southern Mesopotamian sites often preserve long sequences of occupation, rebuilding, abandonment, and reuse. Mud brick buildings collapse back into mud. New walls rise over old ones. Floors accumulate. Temples are rebuilt on sacred places. Cities shift with rivers, politics, climate, and human need. What looks like one city may actually be many cities layered into one mound. A mound is time made visible. The Arabic word often used for such a mound is tell. It describes an accumulated hill formed by repeated human occupation. In Mesopotamia, these tells can contain thousands of years of life folded into earth. You do not walk across 1 year when you cross such a mound. You walk across generations stacked like sleeping breaths. Here, archaeology steadies the mystery. It reminds you that Sumerian civilization was made by real people. They cooked food, repaired tools, sealed jars, traded goods, buried their dead, taught students, argued over property, and rebuilt walls after damage. The ancient world was not made only of gods and secrets. It was made of daily hands. That grounded detail matters deeply. Without it, the Anunnaki become detached from the human world that imagined them. The gods must be understood beside ovens, canals, storerooms, sheep pens, and school tablets. Myth rose from a civilization that needed to survive materially. The same people who told of divine decrees also worried about barley yields. A quiet attention peak waits inside a seal impression. A small lump of clay, once used to secure a door, jar, basket, or tablet, can preserve the image of authority after the sealed object is gone. A cylinder seal rolled across wet clay might show worshippers animals, divine symbols, heroes, or ritual scenes. It might also carry a name or title. The seal impression says, "Someone controlled access here." Access is memory's sibling. Who may open the jar? Who may enter the storeroom? Who may read the tablet? Who may speak for the god? Every seal is a small statement about trust and restriction. It does not tell a myth directly, yet it belongs to the same social world where knowledge, goods, and sacred roles were guarded. Some unusual fringe interpretations focus intensely on seals and reliefs, especially images of winged beings, fish-cloaked sages, or figures holding ritual objects. They sometimes describe these as evidence of technology, genetic manipulation, or advanced non-human instruction. These readings are popular in ancient mystery circles, but they move beyond what the archaeological context can prove. Still, the images are not meaningless. They are symbolic technology of another kind. A protective figure carved beside a doorway works on fear. A seal image works on identity. A divine symbol works on recognition. A ritual object works on the boundary between visible action and invisible effect. Ancient people built powerful systems of image, touch, and repetition long before modern machines. Their technologies were social, sacred, and psychological as well as practical. That may be less flashy, is also more human. You kneel near a broken statue in the trench. Only the lower half remains. The feet are planted firmly. The surface is worn. Someone once shaped this object for attention, perhaps devotion, perhaps representation, perhaps power. Now it is damaged. Its missing upper body becomes another silence your mind wants to fill. Archaeologists resist filling too quickly. They record, they compare, they date, they examine style, material, context, and parallels. They ask whether the object was found where it originally stood or moved later. They ask whether destruction was violent, accidental, ritual, or simply the result of collapse. Every answer affects memory. The open, scholarly uncertainty concerns how directly material finds can be linked to mythic texts. A temple layer may show long sacred use, but it cannot by itself prove a later myth about a god. A seal may show a divine scene, but interpretation depends on iconographic comparison. A flood deposit may show local flooding, but not necessarily the cosmic flood of literature. Archaeology gives weight. It does not always give names. This is why buried cities are both reassuring and unsettling. They confirm that the world behind the myths was real. The rivers, cities, temples, scribes, seals, workers, and kings. Yet they rarely confirm the mythic meaning in a simple way. The more carefully you dig, the more you discover that reality and story touched constantly, but did not become identical. A tablet found in a school may preserve a flood story. A flood layer may preserve a natural disaster. Between them lies the human act of meaning. That act is where memory lives. You walk past baskets of pottery fragments. Each shard is tagged, sorted, and studied. The work is slow, almost meditative. Nothing about it resembles a dramatic treasure hunt. Real excavation is patient attention to broken things. A cooking pot can matter more than gold because it tells how people lived. There is a soft lesson there. The past survives mostly as ordinary damage, yet ordinary damage can carry extraordinary implication. A city rebuilt many times suggests resilience. A temple rebuilt in the same place suggests sacred continuity. A seal impression suggests administration. A school tablet suggests training. A broken myth tablet suggests that someone valued a story enough to copy it. The Anunnaki enter archaeology indirectly. You will not dig up fear itself. You will not lift divine anxiety from the earth in a labelled box. What you find are the systems in which such ideas made sense, institutions that controlled memory, images that marked sacred authority, tablets that preserved divine order, and cities that layered human effort under the names of gods. This is enough to deepen the question. If human memory was feared, it was feared in a world where memory had become material. It could be sealed, stored, broken, buried, recovered, and reinterpreted. A myth that once belonged to a temple school could become, after excavation, a modern mystery. The clay did not only survive ancient control, it escaped into future curiosity. That escape is quiet but profound. No ancient king intended a modern reader to sit calmly at night, wondering whether divine beings feared human memory. No temple administrator planned for broken tablets to become fragments of global imagination. No scribe pressing a school exercise imagined his signs crossing languages, religions, empires, and machines of translation. The archive has left its original walls. A hot wind moves over the excavation mound. The trench shadows lengthen. Workers cover delicate surfaces to protect them from night air. The site grows still, but not empty. Beneath your feet, Other rooms remain unexcavated. Other tablets may still sleep. Other seals may still hold images no one has seen for thousands of years. The ground keeps more than answers, it keeps delay. Perhaps that is why buried cities suit this story so well. They reveal enough to keep you honest and conceal enough to keep you humble. They show that ancient people built, measured, worshipped, wrote, and remembered. They also show that much of what they meant has slipped beyond complete recovery. In the fading light, a broken seal lies beside a piece of tablet. One guarded access, one carried memory, both are small enough to fit in your hand. Yet together they suggest a whole civilization's quiet struggle. To preserve order, to manage knowledge, to honor gods, to survive time, and perhaps to keep certain questions buried until clay, by its patient nature, brought them back. Language is the oldest doorway that still opens halfway. You can stand before a tablet and see only marks, but a trained reader sees sound, grammar, habit, and inherited thought pressed into clay. The signs are small, but they carry a world's architecture. A single word may hold law, ritual, fear, rank, offering, wisdom, and fate inside it. Not because the word is magical by itself, but because generations taught it to carry weight. Sumerian is especially haunting for this reason. It's one of the earliest written languages known from ancient Mesopotamia, and it later survived as a learned and liturgical language after everyday speech had shifted in many places toward Akkadian. That means scribes studied Sumerian not only as communication, but as a prestige language of old authority, temple tradition, scholarship, and sacred inheritance. A language can die in the street, then continue inside ritual. That is a quiet attention peak, because it shows how memory can outlive ordinary use. A word no longer spoken by a market seller may still be recited by a priest. A phrase forgotten by children may still be copied in a school. A divine name may remain powerful even when its oldest pronunciation is debated by people who live centuries later. You sit beside a scholar's lamp while the tablet rests in low light. The clay looks silent until the signs begin to separate. A divine determinative appears before a god's name. A sign points toward kingship. Another leans toward fate. Another carries the trace of wisdom, command, foundation, or sacred order. Translation begins, but translation is never a clean transfer. It is more like crossing a river on stones you hope will hold. Some stones shift, words connected to destiny, divine decree, and sacred power are especially difficult. In Mesopotamian thought, a destiny was not simply a private future waiting to happen. A destiny could be fixed, spoken, determined, or assigned by gods. It belonged to the structure of existence. To know a destiny was to know something about where a being, city, or king, or event belonged. That makes language more than description. Language becomes placement. When a god names, the world changes. When a king is named by divine favour, his rule gains depth. When a scribe places a divine sign before a name, the tablet teaches the eye to recognize sacred status. The written line guides thought before the reader has time to resist. This is how memory can be encoded, not hidden like a treasure under a floor, but embedded inside ordinary categories. The word for king carries more than a ruler. The word for temple carries more than a building. The word for wisdom carries more than cleverness. The word for divine power carries an entire imagined structure of civilization. The Anunnaki exist inside this language world. Their name is not simply an object you can lift out of a tablet and place into modern speculation without loss. It belongs to grammar, genre, period, city, theology, and scribal practice. Across time, the term can shift. It can refer to great gods, underworld powers, judges, or a broader divine group depending on context. Scholars remain careful here. They debate details of usage, development, and translation because ancient terms rarely behave like modern labels. A word can gather meanings over centuries. A divine group can be understood differently in different compositions. A later text may preserve older language while giving it newer significance. This uncertainty does not remove the mystery. It makes it more responsible. You run your thumb in imagination, near the edge of a tablet without touching the signs. The clay is rough where broken, smooth where shaped. A missing corner has taken away the ending of a line. These surviving words suggest a divine act, but the verb is damaged. One translator chooses a cautious phrase, another offers a different possibility. A footnote in a scholar's mind becomes a shadow in the story. The ancient language resists final capture. That resistance is healthy. A fringe reading often begins by treating words as if they have one secret meaning. A divine name becomes a code. A term for wisdom becomes technology. A reference to heaven becomes outer space. A sacred power becomes machinery. Such interpretations may be imaginative, but they often flatten ancient language into modern desire. The better mystery listens more slowly. It asks why ancient people use certain words again and again around order, wisdom, fate, kingship, labour, and divine authority. It asks why civilization was described as something arranged through powers beyond humans. It asks why memory had to be taught in difficult languages, through trained hands, inside institutions with sacred weight. The language itself suggests that memory was not casual, it was layered. A temple hymn might use old phrases because oldness carried authority. A royal inscription might borrow sacred vocabulary to make a political act feel cosmic. A myth might preserve a word whose meaning had shifted, leaving later scribes to copy a sound whose first emotional force they only partly understood. This is how old instruction survives, not as a clear manual. As pressure inside vocabulary, you hear a student whisper a Sumerian line under his breath. He may speak Akkadian at home, or hear multiple languages in the city, but the school makes him copy Sumerian signs. The old words feel formal, difficult, and powerful. He learns them through repetition before he fully inhabits them. A strange thing happens when people memorize words they do not completely own. The words begin to own part of them. This is not supernatural. It is how education works. A sacred language shapes the rhythm of thought. It teaches which ideas belong together. It gives the past a voice that sounds older than living speech. When the student writes those words, he becomes a vessel for an earlier order. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns how much meaning later scribes attach to the old terms they copied. Some may have understood deeply, some may have worked from inherited explanations, some may have preserved traditional lines because they belong to a curriculum. We cannot enter every ancient mind. We can only watch the signs move through time. That movement is enough. It shows that memory can survive even when understanding changes. A word copied faithfully may carry a concept no longer felt in the same way. A myth recited in a later age may preserve a phrase from an older theology. A divine name may endure while its earliest local associations fade. Language becomes a vessel sailing through centuries with cargo that shifts during the journey. This is where the idea of feared memory becomes subtle. Perhaps what unsettled authority was not that humans might remember an exact forbidden sentence. Exact sentences break, tablets crack, pronunciations change. What survives more deeply are patterns of meaning. Humans remember that fate can be decreed, that wisdom can be granted, that kingship can descend, that gods can gather in councils, that a flood can divide time, that some knowledge comes from before the present order. Those patterns become available again whenever language is read. Even damaged language, the Anunnaki, then, are not merely remembered as names. They are remembered through a whole network of words that make them possible. Heaven, earth, underworld, decree, assembly, fate, city, temple, offering, wisdom, kingship, and origin. Remove the network, and the name becomes empty. Preserve the network, and the name begins to breathe again. A lamp flickers. The scholar leans closer. One sign might mean this. Another might mean that. The line could be restored one way, or left uncertain. The honest translator does not force the clay to speak more clearly than it can. Yet even cautious translation opens an ancient corridor. You do not get the whole past. You get an angle of entry. That is enough for wonder. A word is a small ruin. You can walk around it for a lifetime and still find another doorway. As night deepens, the tablet's language feels less like a message and more like a preserved way of arranging reality. It does not tell you plainly that divine powers feared human memory. It shows a world where memory was built from sacred categories, guarded phrases, inherited names, and old words still alive after daily speech had moved away. If memory lives in language, then controlling language shapes memory. But language is also slippery. It travels, mutates, hides, returns, and wakes in new mouths. The old signs may sleep for centuries, then suddenly become readable again. A forgotten word for fate may begin troubling modern thought. A divine name may step out of clay into imagination, and somewhere in that return, the ancient fear whispers softly, humans did not remember everything. They remembered enough. Forgetting does not always look like loss. Sometimes it looks like mercy. A city forgets the exact face of a defeated king, and life becomes easier for his grandchildren. A family forgets the full bitterness of an old dispute, and neighbours can share water again. A temple forgets one local version of a myth, and another version holds the people together. Time covers sharp things so that hands can keep working. Yet forgetting can also be arranged. That is the uneasy thought. In every civilization, memory has guardians. Some are official, like scribes, priests, kings, teachers, archivists, and judges. Others are quiet, like mothers, singers, labourers, elders, and mourners. Each group preserves a different past. Each group also lets certain things fall away, either by choice, pressure, habit, or exhaustion. You stand in a street after sunset. The mud brick walls are cooling. A small fire burns near a doorway. Someone is grinding grain inside a house. A child asks a question, and an older voice answers with a story that begins in ordinary speech, not temple language. This memory will never be pressed into clay. It lives only while someone cares to repeat it. That makes it fragile. It also makes it free. Written memory has authority, but household memory has warmth. A tablet can preserve a king's name for thousands of years, while a grandmother's story may vanish in 2 generations. Yet the grandmother may remember things the tablet refuses to hold. Hunger, fear, unfair labour, a missing son, the smell of flood water, the private doubt behind public worship. This is one of history's oldest imbalances. Power writes more often than pain. The mainstream historical detail is simple and important. Most surviving Mesopotamian texts come from institutional contexts. Temples, palaces, schools, administrative systems, legal practices, and elite scribal culture. They are invaluable, but they do not represent every voice equally. The people who built canals, carried bricks, brewed beer, raised children, and served households left fewer direct words of their own. The archive remembers upward. Life remembers everywhere. This unevenness may be the root of the fear beneath forgetting. If official memory can outlast living memory, then authority can slowly become the only past that survives. A king's restoration becomes more durable than a worker's exhaustion. A temple hymn becomes more durable than a private doubt. A divine decree becomes more durable than the question someone was afraid to ask aloud. But living memory resists perfect burial. It leaks through myths. The flood story remembers divine disagreement. The creation story remembers that humans were made for labour. The king list remembers impossible time before ordinary kings. The sage traditions remember wisdom before the present order. Even when these stories support sacred authority, they preserve traces of discomfort. That is a quiet attention peak. The official stories did not erase the troubling parts. They carried them. You can feel the tension in that. It suggests that ancient memory was not simply controlled from above. It was negotiated. Priests, scribes, kings, and communities inherited materials too meaningful to discard completely. They could reshape them, frame them, ritualize them, but some difficult images remained because removing them would damage the tradition itself. This is how forgetting becomes selective rather than total. A culture may forget the historical event behind a myth, yet preserve the emotional pattern. It may forget the original city conflict, yet preserve the divine argument. It may forget the human disaster, yet preserve the flood. It may forget the first teacher, yet preserve the idea of wisdom coming from before the flood. The Anunnaki question lives inside this selective survival. If they represent powers of order, judgment, and cosmic arrangement, then human memory becomes a strange mirror held up to them. The mirror is cracked, but not blank. It does not show a clear face. It shows fragments, councils, decrees, labour, flood, sages, kingship, destiny, and the repeated need to keep humanity within bounds. A fringe reading might say that deliberate forgetting was imposed to hide humanity's true origin. That claim reaches farther than the evidence allows. The tablets do not prove a single hidden program of erasure, yet ancient institutions did shape memory, and they did preserve some traditions while excluding others. The sober version is still powerful. Forgetting can be produced without one grand secret. It can happen through curriculum. It can happen when only certain people read. It can happen when one language becomes sacred and another becomes ordinary. It can happen when local tales never enter the archive. It can happen when a city falls and its school tradition dies with it. It can happen when a tablet breaks at the very line modern curiosity most wants to hear. No conspiracy is required, only time, power, and clay. The open, scholarly uncertainty concerns how much ancient people themselves recognize these layers. Did a later scribe copying an old flood story feel the depth of earlier memory inside it? Did a temple singer know that a hymn preserved traces of older theology? Did a king scribe understand when political memory had reshaped local tradition? Sometimes, perhaps. Often we cannot know. Ancient minds are not open tablets. They are lost rooms with light under the door. You walk beside a canal at night. The water is black and slow. Frogs call from the reeds. A clay cup sits abandoned near a wall. The temple rises behind you, less visible than felt. Its rituals have ended for the day. But the order it represents continues in sleep, debt, hunger, law, calendar, and fear. A society does not stop governing when people close their eyes. It governs through what they believe morning means. That is why memory matters. If people wake believing the world began with divine order and must be maintained through temple service, then labour has cosmic meaning. If they wake remembering that gods once nearly destroyed humans for becoming troublesome, then obedience has a shadow. If they wake knowing that wisdom survived through secret warning, then curiosity has a sacred ancestor. Memory shapes the inner weather of a civilization. Forgetting shapes it too. Perhaps the fear beneath forgetting was not simply that humans would uncover one lost fact. A single fact can be denied, debated, or ignored. The deeper danger is pattern recognition. Humans might begin to see that stories of origin, labours, flood, instruction, kingship, and destiny all circle around control. They might see that their place in the world was narrated before they could question it. That recognition is quiet. It does not require shouting in a marketplace. It can happen in a scribe's tired mind, a priest's uneasy pause, a labourer's remembered proverb, or a child asking why the gods needed offerings if they were so powerful. The question may vanish, or it may survive in altered form. The ancient world had many ways to answer. Because the gods are great. Because the city must endure. Because this is how the ancestors did it. Because disorder brings hunger. Because the flood showed what happens when boundaries fail. Because memory itself must be disciplined, or it becomes a second river. That last image feels right. Memory is water, guided. It feeds fields, uncontrolled. It breaks walls, stagnant. It sickens, cut off. It leaves the land dry. A wise city does not destroy water. it channels it. Perhaps ancient institutions treated memory the same way, not as an enemy, but as a force requiring banks. Yet rivers do not always obey. They shift under silt. They seep beneath walls. They leave salt behind. They create marshes where maps expected roads. Human memory behaves with the same patient disobedience. It accepts channels for a while, then finds an old course after rain. As the night air cools, you sense why forgetting might have seemed protective. Too much memory can burden the mind. Too much origin can make the present feel fragile. Too many versions can dissolve trust. A people must forget some things to continue living, but forced forgetting has a cost. It leaves a hollow place, and hollow places call to memory. They become dreams, myths, strange numbers in king lists, flood survivors, fish-cloaked sages, and divine councils that sound too much like administrations of a world already anxious about being remembered. The canal water moves under the dark. It carries silt you cannot see, somewhere beneath temple, house, school, and field. The old question continues to move with it. Was forgetting a punishment, a kindness, a political necessity, or a sacred boundary? The tablets do not answer completely. They only show a civilization building walls around memory while leaving enough cracks for the river to sing through. Power rarely erases time all at once. It edits. A king does not always need to burn every older record. Sometimes he only needs to restore a temple in his own name, rebuild a wall with his own inscription, repeat an older ritual under his own authority, and place himself inside a chain of sacred memory. The past remains visible, but its pathway now passes through him. This is how time becomes political. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers often presented themselves as chosen by gods, beloved by city deities, restorers of temples, shepherds of people, and protectors of cosmic order. Their inscriptions did not merely say, "I ruled." They said, "I belonged in the pattern. I received favour. I restored what was ancient. I returned the world to its proper shape." Restoration is a powerful word. It makes change sound like obedience. You stand before a foundation deposit hidden beneath a temple wall. It may contain a small inscribed object, a brick, a cone, or another marker placed where ordinary visitors would never see it. Its purpose is not public decoration. It speaks to gods, future builders, and time itself. It says that this ruler placed his name beneath sacred architecture. A king wants to be remembered where the wall meets the earth. That detail is quiet, but striking. Royal memory did not only stand in visible monuments. It could be buried deliberately, placed inside foundations, protected from ordinary eyes, and addressed to future restorers. The inscription might ask a later king to respect the builder's name. It might curse anyone who removes it. It might insist that the ruler's work belongs within a divine order. Memory becomes masonry. The mainstream historical frame is clear. Royal inscriptions in Mesopotamia often served ideological purposes. They connected kings to gods, temples, victories, justice, building projects, and ancient legitimacy. They are precious sources, but they must be read carefully because they present power as power wished to be remembered. A royal text is not a diary. It is a crafted future. This matters because the Anunnaki question also concerns crafted futures. If divine order depends on memory, kings become earthly managers of that memory. They cannot usually rewrite the whole cosmos, but they can choose which temple to rebuild, which god to honour, which conquest to call restoration, which old tradition to claim, and which rival memory to push into shadow. The result is not simple falsehood. It is shaped remembrance. You walk through a temple construction site in the warm light of late afternoon. Workers carry baskets of mud. Brickmakers press clay into wooden moulds. A scribe notes deliveries. Priests inspect spaces where rituals will resume. The king may be far away, but his name is already entering the bricks. The wall rises in layers. So does the story. This is how political memory joins sacred memory. The temple existed before the current ruler. The god's presence is older than his reign. The city's traditions reach back into time he didn't create. Yet by rebuilding the sacred place, he places himself inside its long memory. He becomes the one through whom ancient order returns. There is a gentle irony here. A king claims to restore the past, while making sure the restored past remembers him. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns how people outside royal and temple circles received these claims. Did workers accept the king's restoration language? Did local families see continuity, burden, or both? Did priests welcome royal patronage while preserving their own older traditions? Texts rarely tell us the full range of responses. They speak most clearly from the side of authority, but silence does not mean agreement. A labourer's body may remember the restoration differently from the inscription. The brick records piety. The shoulders remember weight. The king says he renewed the temple. The worker remembers the heat, the dust, the ration, the ache, the overseer's voice, and the day his child was ill. Both memories are real. Only one is likely to be buried in the foundation. This imbalance is where edited time becomes most powerful. Official memory is not always invented, but it is selective. It chooses the angle from which future readers will see the event. A conquest becomes pacification. Forced labour becomes service. A political alliance becomes divine favour. A new dynasty becomes ancient destiny returning to its proper seat. That kind of editing can happen without destroying earlier memory completely. It places older fragments inside a new frame. The Anunnaki, as figures of divine order and judgment, would fit naturally within such a world of framed memory. A ruler's legitimacy depended on gods who recognized, chose, or permitted him. If kingship descended from heaven in old tradition, then every earthly king lived under the need to explain why heaven had allowed his rule. The king list does this on a large scale. Royal inscriptions do it at ground level. A fringe reading might suggest that priests and kings deliberately rewrote ancient memories of the Anunnaki to make divine powers appear more distant, more symbolic, or more manageable. That interpretation reaches beyond what can be firmly shown. Yet the broader historical principle is sound. Stories of gods and kings were transmitted through institutions that had reasons to preserve order. Memory served legitimacy, but it also carried older discomfort. The flood remained. The impossible rains remained. The divine quarrels remained. The creation of humans for labour remained. The secret warning remained. The sages before the flood remained. If power edited time, it did not erase every troubling line. Perhaps it could not. Perhaps those lines were too woven into the sacred fabric to remove without tearing the whole garment. That is a quiet attention peak. The most controlled traditions still kept their ghosts. You enter a room where old tablets are being recopied. A teacher dictates a line from a composition already ancient to him. A student repeats it and presses the signs. The student does not know which parts once belonged to local tradition, which were reshaped by schools, which were favoured by temples, and which survived because a king's court valued them. He copies what he has received, yet the received past is not pure. It has travelled through desire, fear, reverence, politics, convenience, and loss. Every copy preserves and changes. A spelling shifts, a title expands, a god's role is emphasized, a king's name becomes attached to restoration. A city's tradition enters a wider system. This is not corruption in a simple sense. It is transmission. All memory transmitted by humans changes. The question is who gains power through the change. In Mesopotamia, rulers and temples had strong positions in this process because they commanded resources, scribes, buildings, and ritual authority. They could make certain memories durable. That durability shaped the future's imagination. You feel the roughness of a stamped brick. The king's name presses from its surface like a voice asking not to be lost. The brick is humble, but the message is ambitious. It wants to outlast weather, rebellion, indifference, and replacement. It wants the future to read the building as devotion. The future may read it differently. Modern archaeology can see both devotion and politics. It can admire craft while questioning claims. It can study royal language as evidence of ideology rather than transparent fact. This double reading is one of the gifts of distance. You can listen respectfully without obeying the inscription. That distance would be dangerous inside the ancient order. To step outside official memory is to gain comparison. You see how kings present themselves similarly across centuries. You see how many rulers claim restoration. You see how often power calls itself ancient, necessary, and divinely favoured. The pattern becomes visible only when memory gathers enough examples. This may be one reason human memory, especially written memory, becomes difficult for authority. A single inscription glorifies. Many inscriptions compare. The more tablets survive, the more the future can notice repetition, contradiction, exaggeration, and silence. A king may intend memory to serve him, but too much memory can expose the machinery of royal speech. It can show how sacred language is used repeatedly to make power feel inevitable. Perhaps the same is true of divine order. One myth instructs, many myths question. When creation stories, flood stories, sage traditions, king lists, and royal inscriptions sit side by side, they create more than obedience. They create a field of comparison. Humans begin to see that origins are told in patterns. They see that authority always wants ancestry. They see that memory is not only what power preserves, but also what power cannot fully control once preserved. The sun drops behind the temple wall. The newly laid bricks darken. Workers rinse their hands. The foundation deposit lies hidden beneath sacred architecture, waiting for a future it cannot imagine. Above it, the king's name enters the building. Beneath it, older soil holds earlier walls, earlier names, earlier silences. Here, time is never one layer. Power may edit the surface just so that the ground remembers beneath it, and somewhere between buried foundation and spoken hymn, human memory learns the oldest political lesson. Those who claim to restore the beginning may also be rewriting the path back to it. The most dangerous memory is not always accurate. Sometimes it is wrong in the way a dream is wrong, carrying a truth of feeling while misplacing the furniture of fact. A name shifts, a city moves, a god becomes larger than he once was. A human figure becomes half divine in the telling. A lost teacher becomes a sage. A difficult ruler becomes a monster or a hero. Memory changes shape because human beings need meaning, not only data. This is why remembering wrongly can still disturb power. A perfectly official record stays within its frame. A mistaken memory wanders. It connects things that institutions prefer to keep separate. It hears an old flood story inside a local disaster. It sees divine anxiety inside ritual order. It links a royal inscription with labour pain. It turns a god's decree into a question about who benefits from destiny. You're walking at night through a city where most lamps have gone out. The mud brick walls hold a faint warmth from the day. A dog moves through an alley. Somewhere behind a curtain, an old voice tells a child a story that would not satisfy a scribe. The sequence is loose. The names are softened. The gods are too near, too human, too strange. Yet the child listens. This is memory outside the school. No teacher corrects it. No colophon identifies the tablet. No priest fixes the line. No king adds his name to the foundation. The story lives in breath, and because it lives there, it can bend around fear. It can protect what official memory cannot openly say. It can turn unease into symbol. Ancient Mesopotamian literature understood the danger of crossing boundaries. There are stories where humans encounter divine secrets, seek immortality, challenge limits, or receive knowledge that does not settle them. Gilgamesh searches for life beyond death and returns with wisdom marked by failure. Adapa gains access to divine space but loses immortality through instruction, caution, or misunderstanding, depending on how the tale is read. These stories do not simply punish curiosity. They complicate it. That is important. In Mesopotamian thought, wisdom was precious, but not every form of knowing brought safety. Divination, ritual knowledge, writing, and scholarship were respected. yet they required training and correct context. Knowledge outside proper channels could mislead, endanger, or separate a person from ordinary human limits. The human who remembers wrongly stands near that edge, not because he knows nothing, because he knows partially. Partial knowledge is powerful and unstable. A broken tablet works this way. A damaged myth works this way. A dream of origin works this way. It gives enough shape to provoke desire, but not enough structure to satisfy caution. The mind completes what clay no longer holds. That is the quiet attention peak. A fragment can be more haunting than a complete text. A complete text may tell you where to stop. A fragment leaves the doorway open. It lets memory enter with its own shadows. Perhaps this is why ancient myths often remain so alive after scholarly explanation. Their gaps invite later minds to participate. The reader becomes, unwillingly, a restorer of lost lines. This restoration can be careful. It can also become wild. A fringe interpretation of the Anunnaki often begins in such gaps. Broken texts, strange images, immense rains, divine councils, and creation myths are gathered into one modern pattern. In that pattern, human beings may be remembered as altered, managed, or limited by beings who feared the recovery of human origin. This is speculative and should not be treated as established history. Yet the emotional engine behind it is understandable. People sense that ancient records do not fit neatly into modern categories. Myth is not mere fiction. History is not fully recoverable. Archaeology confirms much, but not everything. The human mind notices the missing pieces and begins to dream around them. Ancient people did this too. They lived with ruins already old to them. They rebuilt temples over earlier temples. They copied languages no longer spoken in daily life. They inherited flood stories from a time no living person had seen. They looked at old bricks, old names, old gods, and perhaps felt what you feel now. The past is not gone, but it is not fully obedient. Remembering wrongly may have been one way to keep contact with it. A ritual version preserves order. A dream version preserves disturbance. A king's version preserves legitimacy. A household version preserves grief. A scribe's version preserves form. None is the whole past. Together, they show how memory survives by dividing itself. The open scholarly uncertainty concerns how ancient audiences understood mythic truth. Did they hear these stories literally, symbolically, ritually, politically, morally, or in some mixture we cannot reconstruct? Modern categories can be too rigid. An ancient listener might accept a story as sacred without asking whether it matched physical history in the modern sense. Truth could live in function. A story was true if it placed the world correctly. This makes the Anunnaki question more subtle. If a myth placed humanity beneath divine order, it helped stabilize society. If it also preserved divine conflict, secret warning, and pre-flood memory, it allowed unease to remain inside stability. A listener might not separate these layers. The story could comfort and trouble at the same time. You pause beside a wall where moonlight catches a broken brick. The surface looks pale, almost bone-coloured. Someone has scratched a small mark into it, not formal writing, perhaps only a worker's sign or a later hand's idle pressure. It will never enter a royal inscription. It may never be studied. Yet it reminds you that humans always leave marks outside approved memory. Some marks are intentional. Some are accidental. Some are misunderstandings that become tradition. The human who remembers wrongly may be dangerous because he is not fully under institutional control. He may combine the temple myth with his father's story, the flood tale with a recent storm, the king's claim with the ache in his own back, the god's name with a dream. His memory becomes a crossroads. Authority prefers straight roads. Myth prefers crossroads. In stories of divine boundaries, humans often suffer when they seek what belongs beyond them. Yet those same stories are preserved by human culture, which means the boundary violation becomes memorable. A warning against dangerous knowledge becomes a form of knowledge. A tale about limits teaches listeners where the limit lies, and by doing so, reveals that a beyond exists. This is the paradox. To forbid a memory is to point toward it. To ritualize a secret is to keep it alive. To warn against crossing a boundary is to draw the boundary clearly enough for someone to imagine crossing. Perhaps this is why human memory could never be made entirely safe. Even corrected memory contains hints. Even wrong memory may preserve emotional truth. Even a distorted story may carry the shape of an older wound. You do not need perfect recall to become restless. You only need enough to feel that the official explanation is not the whole sky. The night deepens over the city. The child behind the curtain is asleep now. The old storyteller has stopped speaking. No tablet was made. No scribe approved the words. By morning, some details will already change, yet the story has entered another mind, and that mind may one day repeat it differently. This is how memory escapes measurement. It does not always fight. It drifts. It misquotes. It dreams. It confuses gods and kings, temples and stars, flood and grief, origin and fear. It becomes less accurate, but sometimes more revealing. It remembers not only what happened, but what people could not stop feeling about what happened. If the Anunnaki feared human memory, perhaps they feared this most of all, not the archive that could be sealed, but the living mind that could misunderstand its way toward a forbidden question. The archive under moonlight does not look like a place of danger. It looks still. A room of broken tablets, sealed fragments, practice exercises, royal claims, hymns, accounts, and myths rests beneath a quiet sky. The walls are only mud brick. The shelves are only old supports, long collapsed or imagined back into place. The objects are small enough to be ignored by anyone searching for obvious power. Yet the room feels heavy, not because it proves one grand secret. It does not. The tablets are too varied, too damaged, too human for that. They speak in administrative lists, sacred songs, legal formulas, school exercises, omen collections, laments, epics, and scanned mythic scenes. They do not form a single hidden message waiting for a simple key. Their power is slower. They preserve the pressure of many beginnings. You stand in the cool dark while the moonlight falls through a broken opening above. Dust floats where the light enters. A tablet lies face down near the wall. Another rests at an angle, cracked across the middle. A small fragment shows only part of a divine name. Another gives numbers with no story attached. The room does not explain which pieces matter most. That uncertainty is honest. Ancient history often works this way. Archaeologists, epigraphers, historians, and Assyriologists rebuild meaning from partial evidence. They study language, context, date, find spot, genre, and comparison. They resist easy conclusions because easy conclusions usually arrive too soon. The past must be approached with patience, especially when myth and material evidence touch. Still, patience does not erase wonder. The archive gathers the themes like clay gathers fingerprints: divine order, human labour, flood memory, sacred kingship, pre-flood sages, impossible rains, temple schools, sealed storerooms, words for fate and wisdom, royal efforts to guide memory, household stories that never entered the official record. None of these alone gives a final answer. Together they create an atmosphere. That is the quiet attention peak here. The strongest mystery is not one missing tablet, but the pattern among surviving fragments. You begin to see the pattern without forcing it. Mesopotamian civilization made memory into an institution earlier than almost anywhere else we can read so directly. It externalized memory into clay, trained it in schools, placed it in temples, attached it to kings, guarded it through language, and imagined it under the authority of gods who assign destinies. Memory was not decorative. It was infrastructure. A city could not function without it. A temple could not manage offerings without it. A king could not claim legitimacy without it. A student could not become a scribe without submitting to it. A myth could not survive without repetition. Even divine names in the human world depended on remembered speech and written form. If the Anunnaki were feared as rulers of order, memory was the human force that kept their order alive. But that same force also made their order visible. This is the strange reversal. A system that records itself becomes legible. A hierarchy that preserves its own language leaves evidence of its structure. A myth that explains human servitude also reveals divine dependence. A flood story that restores cosmic order also preserves divine disagreement. A king list that glorifies sacred kingship also exposes the blurred seam between myth and history. The archive obeys. Then it betrays, not loudly, not intentionally. It betrays by surviving too well, and by surviving in pieces that later minds can compare. A tablet meant for a school becomes a clue. A royal inscription meant to glorify becomes evidence of political memory. A broken myth meant to preserve sacred order becomes a doorway into ancient anxiety. This betrayal is not malicious. It is what happens when memory outlives control. A fringe reading sees this room as the leftover evidence of an ancient suppression. The Anunnaki feared humans remembering their true origin, so the priestly world converted hard memory into myth. That idea carries emotional force, but it remains beyond proof. The responsible version is quieter and perhaps deeper. Ancient institutions did shape memory, yet they could not fully contain what memory would become after burial, recovery, translation, and reinterpretation. A tablet changes meaning when its audience changes. To a temple scribe, it may be curriculum. To a king, it may be legitimacy. To a priest, it may be sacred continuity. To a modern reader, it may be a fragment of a question no one in the ancient room intended to ask in this form. That does not make the modern question invalid. It makes it different. The open, scholarly uncertainty is not whether the Anunnaki literally feared memory in a simple emotional sense. That cannot be established from the evidence. The better uncertainty is how ancient Mesopotamian traditions understood the relationship between divine authority, human knowledge, and remembered origins. The texts show concern with order, destiny, wisdom, labour, flood survival, and sacred transmission. How those concerns fit together remains debated. You listen to the archive as if it were breathing. It is not. But the human mind hears breath where patterns gather. It hears an old rhythm in the tablets, a sign, record, remember, break, restore, copy, bury, recover. That rhythm is almost the rhythm of civilization itself. A world is arranged. A world is damaged. A world is written. A world is misunderstood. A world is read again. Moonlight touches the edge of a tablet. These signs are shallow but visible. Perhaps they record barley. Perhaps a line of myth. Perhaps a name in a list. The difference matters to scholarship, but in the quiet of the room, every tablet belongs to the same miracle. Someone believed the moment deserved a mark. That belief is humanity's oldest argument against disappearance. The Anunnaki, as remembered powers, stand on the other side of that argument. They belong to traditions where destinies are decreed, roles are assigned, and the cosmos has ranks. Yet human marking introduces a second durability. Divine decree may establish order, but writing preserves the fact that order needed establishment. This is subtle. It is the kind of thought that arrives late at night, when the room is still and the tablets seem less like artifacts than pauses in a very long conversation. If humans had remembered nothing, the divine order would appear complete and unquestioned. Because humans remembered in clay, the order appears constructed, maintained, narrated, and sometimes anxious. A constructed order can still be sacred, but it is no longer invisible. You move slowly past the shelves. One tablet contains a student's awkward signs. Another contains careful work by a trained scribe. One preserves a royal name. One may preserve a ritual. Another might be only a receipt. Yet the receipt tells you that someone once cared about exact quantities at an exact moment in time. Exactness is a form of hope. It says the world can be held. But the broken tablet says something else. It says the world cannot be held completely. Edges fall, lines vanish, names lose sounds, cities sink, gods change roles, languages become scholarly puzzles, archives become ruins, memory survives, but never as a whole. Perhaps that incompleteness is why the story remains sleep-friendly rather than sharp. There is no final confrontation hidden in the room, no sudden revelation, no single tablet that turns myth into certainty, only a slow gathering of clues that remain humble under the weight of time. The clay does not demand belief, it invites attention. Under moonlight, attention becomes almost a ritual of its own. You notice the old human need to preserve beginnings. You notice the divine need to be remembered. You notice the institutional need to manage memory. You notice the living mind's need to wander past official boundaries. And you notice that fear may not be the opposite of memory. Fear may be one reason memory becomes sacred. A society afraid of chaos remembers order. A king afraid of being forgotten writes his name. A temple afraid of neglect repeats ritual. A people afraid of losing their beginning copies old stories. A mythic divine order afraid of human wandering teaches humans where memory should stop. Yet memory rarely stops exactly there. The archive under moonlight remains quiet. Its tablets neither prove nor deny the oldest speculation. They simply endure, holding the marks of people who served, counted, prayed, copied, ruled, wondered, and sometimes preserved more than they understood. In that endurance, the Anunnaki mystery becomes softer and somehow larger. The question is no longer whether a god once trembled before a human thought. It is whether any order, divine or earthly, can fully survive the moment humans begin writing down not only what they are told, but also the fragments that make them wonder. The last unread line is not hidden because someone placed it far away. It is hidden because time has made it ordinary. It may sit on the lower edge of a broken tablet, where a scribe pressed the final signs of a myth and then set the clay aside to dry. It may belong to a school copy, uneven and young. It may belong to a temple archive, careful and formal. It may belong to a tablet already shattered, with its ending lying somewhere else in dust, river mud, or the storeroom of a museum. You do not know which line it is. That is part of its power. Ancient Mesopotamia does not give you one final answer about the Anunnaki and human memory. It gives you a landscape of evidence and imagination. Tablets, cities, king lists, flood stories, creation myths, scribal schools, ritual traditions, divine councils, royal inscriptions, buried seals, broken statues, and words that survived long after their first speakers vanished. The evidence remains incomplete. The question remains alive. You stand again before the clay tablet in the quiet of a museum room. The glass is cool, the label is modest. It may list date, period, site, language, and acquisition history. It may describe the text as mythological, administrative, lexical, or literary. The language is careful, as it should be. Care is how the past is protected from our hunger, yet hunger still stands beside care. You want to know what the old scribes knew. You want to know whether they preserved memories older than their own temples. You want to know whether the Anunnaki were imagined only as gods of order, or whether their stories carried a deeper anxiety about human beings remembering too far backward. The honest answer is soft. We cannot know in the way certainty wants, but we can notice the patterns. The Sumerian and wider Mesopotamian record shows a civilization deeply concerned with preserving order through memory. It remembered kingship as descending from heaven. It remembered pre-flood rulers in impossible durations. It remembered a flood that divided time. It remembered humans as labourers within divine order. It remembered wisdom arriving through gods, sages, and trained experts. It remembered that writing could carry authority beyond death. It also remembered instability. Gods argued, humans made noise. A flood was sent. A survivor remained. Sages carried wisdom across rupture. Kings kept needing divine favour. Temples kept needing restoration. Scribes kept copying because memory could fail if the hand stopped moving. That is the quiet attention peak at the end. The oldest written civilization we can read so richly was already afraid of forgetting. This does not prove that the Anunnaki literally feared human memory. It does not prove ancient astronaut theories. It does not prove a suppressed history hidden behind every damaged sign. The responsible story must remain careful. Myth is not laboratory evidence, and a broken tablet is not a confession. But myth is not nothing. A myth can reveal what a culture needed to think about. It can preserve anxieties too deep for law codes. It can carry political memory, ritual memory, theological memory, and emotional memory in one vessel. It can say, humans serve, while also saying, gods need them. It can say, order is divine, while also saying, order once nearly broke. The old stories do not need to be literal to be unsettling. They only need to be remembered. You feel the weight of that thought as the museum room darkens in imagination. The tablet is no longer just an artifact. It is a meeting point between clay and mind, between ancient authority and modern curiosity, between what was written and what cannot be restored. The last unread line might not contain a secret. It might contain a ration count, a damaged verb, a repeated divine name, or a schoolboy's awkward mistake. It might be ordinary, but ordinary things often preserve the real structure of the ancient world better than dramatic revelations do. A ration count says labour existed. A divine name says reverence endured. A scribal error says a human hand trembled, rushed, learned, or grew tired. A broken ending says time is stronger than explanation. The fringe imagination wants the last line to say that humans were once deliberately limited, that the Anunnaki feared a memory returning, that the true origin of mankind was sealed in clay. The scholar's caution replies that no such final line has been securely read. The storyteller listens to both, then walks between them with quieter steps. There is value in the space between. Too much certainty ruins the mystery. Too much fantasy ruins the history. The old tablets ask for a third posture, patience. You can let archaeology keep its discipline while allowing myth to keep its night air. You can accept that the Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian religious imagination, while still asking why that imagination so often returns to authority, knowledge, creation, flood, and memory. That question is enough. You do not need to force the clay to speak beyond itself. The open scholarly uncertainty remains. How much of mythic memory preserves historical experience? How much preserves theological reflection? How much preserves political ideology? And how much preserves inherited symbolic patterns older than writing itself? The answer changes by text, period, and context. No single rule unlocks them all. Perhaps that is fitting. A civilization that lived by lists left as a mystery that resists listing. You turn away from the display and return, in the mind, to the river plain. The night is wide. Reeds move softly beside dark water. A mud-brick city rests under stars. Somewhere in its sleeping rooms, people remember differently. A scribe remembers signs. A priest remembers sequence. A king wants his name to endure. A worker remembers heat and weight. A child remembers a story and the voice that first told it. Above them, the gods are remembered too, not as fixed beings in a single book, but as presences shaped by centuries of ritual, fear, devotion, copying, translation, and reinterpretation. The Anunnaki remain partly visible and partly obscured, like figures carved on a worn seal. You can see their outline. You cannot recover their whole face. That may be why they still fascinate. They stand at the meeting point of order and uncertainty. They belong to a world that tried to make memory durable, yet left behind fragments that invite endless remembering. They are not simply answers. They are ancient names around which questions gather. The last unread line may never be found, or it may already have been found and misunderstood. It may rest in a drawer, catalogued correctly but not yet fully appreciated. It may wait in an untranslated fragment. It may have dissolved back into earth long ago. It may not be a line of writing at all. but the silence between texts, the place where official memory ends and human wandering continues, that silence is not empty. It holds the final shape of the mystery. If the Anunnaki feared human memory, perhaps they feared its endurance more than its accuracy. Humans forget details, distort names, misread symbols, and rebuild broken stories from partial evidence. Yet they keep returning. They return to the clay, to the flood, to the first cities, to the sages, to the question of why beings imagined as powerful would ever need to manage what humans could know. The river moves in darkness. A tablet cools under moonlight. A question remains unread, and somewhere inside that question, human memory continues doing what it has always done, serving order, escaping order, and carrying fragments of a beginning that no power, divine or earthly, has ever fully put to sleep. The river has grown quieter now. The city is only a low shape beneath the moon, its walls softened by distance, its temple fading into the same dark earth that once raised it. No lamps burn in the archive, no stylus moves, no teacher corrects a student's hand. The tablets rest as they have rested for centuries, holding marks that no longer hurry toward meaning. Clay cools slowly, so does the mind. You can leave the last question where it is, not solved, not refused, only placed gently beside the others. The Anunnaki become distant again, not as a loud secret, but as old names carried through human memory. The scribes become quiet hands, the kings become weathered inscriptions, the flood becomes dark water moving under stars. Nothing needs to be decided tonight. The ancient world can remain unfinished. Perhaps that is why it follows you so softly into sleep. It does not demand belief. It does not ask for fear. It offers only fragments, a reed stylus, a broken seal, a temple wall, a list of impossible kings, a story of water, a sage beside the marshes, a tablet turned toward moonlight. The rest can stay unread. Outside the buried city, reeds whisper in the night wind. The river carries silt without explaining where it has been. Somewhere beneath the soil, clay remembers pressure from a vanished hand. Somewhere above, the stars remain calm, indifferent, and beautiful. You breathe more slowly. The question sinks lower. Maybe memory was never meant to close the past completely. Maybe it was only meant to keep one small doorway open, just wide enough for wonder to pass through, then fade. The tablet rests. The river moves. The line remains unfinished. End of script. Good night.